Good morning. Good morning, Heidi. Good morning. I now convene the August 1-2-2019 meeting of the Commission of Teacher Credentialing. Will the recording secretary please call roll?
Kathleen Alves, Kirsten Barnes, Aspen Williams Brown, C. Michael Cooney, Marisol de la Torre Exapido, Ana Marie Francois, Jose Gonzalez, Shire, Johanna Harwick, Alicia Hine, Terry Jackson, Bonnie Clapp, Kevin Quinn, Jane Marks, Monica Martinez, Castle Redmond, Ade Rodriguez, Tina Sloan,
Here.
Andrew Wall. We have a quorum.
Thank you. Commissioner Jackson, will you please lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance? Well, it is with great regret that I announce that Jose Gonzalez has stepped down from the commission. No. Mr. Gonzalez was appointed to the commission in June 2014. Throughout his years of service to the commission, he's consistently shown his enthusiasm and commitment to the education of California's children. We value the knowledge and wisdom he's shared with us and truly appreciate his time and effort that he devoted to our work and to the education profession and to the school children of California. Jose has accepted a part-time appointment as the Executive Director of the California Association of Latino Superintendents and Administrators and will undertake the new role while continuing to serve the Planada learning community. So we wish him the very best in his future endeavors, and we will miss him. All right, moving now to our agenda. Agenda item 1A is the approval of the June 2019 minutes. Do I have a motion to approve the 2019 commission minutes? So moved by Commissioner Alves, seconded by Commissioner Barnes. Discussion? All right, all those in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed? Abstentions? One abstention, 2 abstentions, motion carries. I'm sorry, Commissioner Hine and Commissioner De La Escobilla. The next item is 1B, approval of the August 2019 agenda. We have an agenda insert for item 1C. Do I have a motion to approve the August 2019 agenda? So moved. Commissioner Rodriguez, seconded by Commissioner Kung. Thank you. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed? All right. Motion carries. Agenda item 1C is approval of the August 2019 consent calendar. Do commissioners have any items they'd like to consider in closed session? Commissioner Hine.
I have 2, Higgins and Johnson. I'll look it up. Higgins and Johnson.
And Commissioner Hartwig. Any others? Commissioner De La Torre Escobedo.
Number 21, James Coyle.
Commissioner Barnes.
I actually need to recuse myself from number 10, David Bertels.
Okay. Yeah, Commissioner Hind.
I also need to recuse myself, and I will look up the number from first name Clint. I need to look it up.
Okay. Any others? All right. Do I have a motion to approve all remaining items on the consent calendar? Commissioner Alves, seconded by Commissioner De La Torre Escobedo. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed? Motion carries. Okay. So, happy August. Summer's flying by, and though it's a time for a little bit of breather for educators, it is flying by, but it's a time that I think we get an opportunity to reflect and think about what we might do when the new academic year starts. It's also a time that I've been using to reflect since our last meeting in June. I like to have a big picture. I like to have my arms wrapped around the work and think about where we're going and what we're doing. And I have been thinking about our policy work, and I see at least two characterizations of that work. One is that we set policy where we're forging new ground in areas that need our attention. For instance, in our last meeting, we were working on early childhood education, special education, and general education integration. We had early childhood special education standards come forward. We had new performance assessment work around potential administrators. These are all areas that are forging new ground, and that was just in our last meeting. The second thing we do is that when we forge new ground, we learn from the stakeholders who are affected by our policies, and then we go back and we look at how that policy has been set. And Commissioner Sandy was reminding me of 2016 was a big year, and there were roughly 6 big things, big new areas that we had forged. And help me, Commissioner Sandy, in remembering what they were. We had the whole new accreditation system, new standards, new performance assessments, new surveys of our, the new data dashboard. So those were the 6. Yeah. So that was big work. And since then, we've learned a lot about how some of this has gotten implemented, again, with our stakeholders. We're learning about unintended effects and unintended consequences. We're learning about what we've missed. And today's item on clinical practice is one such item, right? And then our last meeting, we had streamlining and the review process for the subject matter prep programs, for instance. And we also corrected a significant problem with the TPA for our candidates working in bilingual settings. That was significant because prior to that, these candidates would have to translate what they were doing in their work. But we also, in the process, expanded our understanding of what it means to educate and learn and teach in bilingual settings. So we're always learning as well. And then there are those things with long historical underpinnings that keep cropping up because times have changed and the policies and legislation that made sense at one time may not make sense anymore. And we're left grappling with what they mean for our work now. So the eminence credential was one such item. So was the early completer option. There are other things that we have. Today we have the annual report on certification exams. And our next meeting will be examining standards and exams for teaching literacy. These are complex issues, and our educational landscape changes all the time, too. The teacher shortage meant new things for us. Changes in the autonomy for schools with LCFF, for instance, means changes for us. Changes in frameworks, changes in content standards. All of those things affect the way we pay attention to our work. So in trying to wrap my arms around this, I come back to one important process for how we do our business, and that's our responsiveness to the ways our policies are affecting the people who are doing the work and benefiting from the work. I've seen this commission come a long way in developing processes for gathering feedback and then making the changes and learning from where we need to go. And I just wanted to end on that note to say how important it is that we have our stakeholders who are engaging with us and informing us, and how important it is that we're responsive to that learning and to making the changes that need to be changed. And I think we've come a long way, and I think we just keep paying attention to that. Thank you. All right. So, get back to my items here. Item 1 is the Executive Director's Report. Mary.
Thank you so much. And I so appreciate that reflection and the kind of identification of a central quality of our work as a commission, that we plant a stake in the ground out there a ways and work toward it and learn a lot along the way. And your willingness to be a learning entity where we take that in and adjust. We don't set a policy and by God, we hold it for 10 years no matter what. We set it, we watch it, we evaluate it. We're ever mindful of what the goal on the horizon was and keeping our focus and movement toward that. And thank you for framing that so articulately. Along those lines, a number of us from the Commission Professional Services Division and myself had the opportunity this week to attend the statewide conference on multi-tiered systems of support. 3,000 educators in Long Beach. And it's really just an amazing groundswell of interest and learning in how we might structure schools differently instructionally for all students. And it's such an important parallel and impetus for work we're doing as we go back and think about the work we did to create this common trunk in the preparation of special education teachers, mindful that our goal here, articulated by this body, is that all teachers should be teachers of all students, and that is a shared responsibility within a school. And everything that we've built in terms of standards and performance assessments is really trying to capture and embody that goal. And this conference was just truly amazing to get numerous sessions on universal designs for learning and what it means to do that in your practice. Principals who are grappling with how to support that and push it with their teachers who are asking big questions about how do I do this? How do I really accommodate all learners? It's not the way many teachers were trained. And so they're here getting a serious shot in the arm and in the head, really, about how do I rethink my practice with an all means all perspective. And it was really just remarkable. Yes, I'm looking over to Terry Clark. She stayed all 3 days, and it was fantastic. So it's a great start to the day and a reminder of our work being part of a much bigger effort to transform schooling for children. So it's been, July has been a nice, slightly a quieter month for us than January through June, which just went by in a huge flash. And so we've been, kind of collecting ourselves and cleaning our desks and getting ready for the new year that we're about to start. Couple of items of business. Well, first of all, I'd just like to say that we on the staff have really appreciated Jose Gonzalez's work and presence here at this table. He's really brought a grounded perspective that was really important. So wherever you are, Jose, Godspeed in your next work. And I know our paths are going to continue to cross. So that's really important. Secondly, I wanted to remind you that the position for the student liaison and applications are open for next year. And I believe that closes in a few weeks. Rhonda, August 9th is the last day to submit the application. So those of you who might know students in training who would like to take a seat at the table, please get the application to them. And then finally, the February 2020 meeting, we've had a change in date. So there were some big meetings here and we couldn't find lodging in downtown Sacramento to host our meeting. So we've moved the dates to January 30 and 31, and that will be posted and sent out to all of our listservs and et cetera. So that concludes my report, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Do any commissioners have items to report? Commissioner Hartwig.
This is less an item to report than just an appreciation to make. As someone who does not work in a school but represents the public's interest in the Commission's work, I just wanted to give my appreciation to all of the commissioners and all of our stakeholders and all of the people who will be starting school within the next month, serving our children for this coming year. I know it's a busy time, and it's really appreciated by myself, and I know by the rest of the California public, the incredible work that's done. So good luck as the school year starts, and thank you, everybody, for your work.
Thank you, Commissioner Hartwig. Are there any other items from commissioners? All right. Do any liaisons have items to report? What, have you all been on summer vacation? Okay. Well, Seeing none, I now recess the general session and move to the Educator Preparation Committee. Commissioner Rodriguez, will you please convene the committee? Thank you.
Good morning. I'd like to call the August 2019 meeting of the Educator Preparation Committee to order. We have 7 agenda items. 4 of the items are scheduled for today, with 3 more tomorrow morning. The first item is 2A, proposed adoption of the passing score standard for the California Administrator Performance Assessment. This item is being presented by Amy Rising, Gay Roby, and Heather Klesch. Is that correct? From Evaluation Systems Group of Pearson. This is an action item. Ms. Rising, will you please begin?
About setting a passing standard as we move into this next year of operational administration. So in June, a standard setting panel was convened, and they reviewed data from the 18-19 administration. That's leading us then into this 19-20 administration and talking about how we move out of a non-consequential administration into a consequential administration. So the membership of the design team is provided for you in your appendix and Appendix A, and a description of the process and all the groups that have been involved all along the way over the last many years to help us with this work in Appendix B. And then all the programs that have been engaged in this work is in Appendix C. And finally, the membership of that standard setting panel is provided for you in Appendix D. So the commission began discussing this, as I said, back in 2012, actually, quite a number of years ago, and passed an action item approving the idea for an administrator performance assessment in 2013. In 2015, the project was funded through the State Budget Act, and the development work began. And to ensure scoring reliability, the Cal APA is centrally managed and scored by calibrated assessors to ensure that detailed analytic feedback based on the CAPE, or the California Administrator Performance Expectations, to make sure that what is provided to candidates in programs is done in a timely manner. Candidates receive score reports within 3 weeks, as do programs and commission staff, and that this data guide both development of program and support to candidates as they move through these administrator programs. So the data, we've worked hard to make sure that it is consistent and reliable, and that it does in fact align with the needs of the accreditation data system, understanding that at some point in time this data will be put on dashboards and made available to all. And that outcomes-based set of quality indicators drives down to the rubric level And so there are 3 cycles and a number of rubrics, and we'll get into the details around that. But the intent is to provide very detailed analytic data to both candidates and their program and their supports colleagues in the K-12 arena to make sure that together we're working to support administrator development. So we moved through the development phase with the design team and into the first pilot year. After that year, we learned a great deal and we iterated on the process and revised the assessment and the rubrics, moving from holistic to analytic. And then we field tested that work. And again, we revised based on what we learned. And then, frankly, between the outcome of the field test and the standard setting study and being ready and to engage in this next operational year, we have revised again. So these are complex assessments. It takes a lot of us together to really be clear about what is expected from candidates and how we measure that and how we report that data back and how we support programs. So as I said, this past year was what we called a non-consequential year, and what that meant was that candidates did not need to pay to take the assessment and that they did not need to meet a passing standard. But they did need to engage, and they needed to engage with all 3 cycles, complete all 3 cycles, and submit them online. And all of that work was scored, and data was returned to both program and candidate. So now we're moving to a consequential year, and what that means is that there will be a standard set, and that they will need to meet that, and they will also be paying for the assessment. So we're moving, into this next phase of this fully operational system. So after 4 years of development and testing, it's now the appropriate time to think about setting a passing standard as we initiate this work and move forward in supporting our programs and our candidates. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Gay Roby, who's going to talk with you a bit about what happened in the pilot and field testing phase.
Thank you. Good morning. The multi-year development of the California Assessment for Administrators is in what Amy was just saying, but in the timeline form on the current slide. You'll see that in 2016, it started in February. We got a lot done that year, in that the Commission adopted the design standards for the assessment, and then the foundational pieces, the performance expectations, which we call the CAPE, were revised. A validity study was held and then adopted by the Commission as a body. That allowed the design team to start working, and they spent 2 years meeting annual or monthly for 1 year, and then bi-monthly for the second year to design, and then, as Amy said, keep revising, finding out what the field said, and had to inform us about the assessments, and went back and again and made sure that the targets were what we wanted them to be, and the results that we were getting back in submissions were what we expected them to be. And then in January through April of 2017, we were able to pilot test. We had 23 institutions come forth and say they would try one of the 3 cycles of the Cal APA, and they did it in very small amounts. Tweaked again, went back out for field testing. It just so happened another 23 institutions, some of which carried over from pilot test, some did not. Tried at least one, some of them tried 2 or 3 of the cycles to see if it fit into their program design. When results came back in, we tweaked again, and then we were fortunate enough in this last year to have a non-consequential implementation where everyone in California did this. So we went from 23 institutions, maybe 1 instructor, 1 little cohort, into all 60 programs, every instructor and every candidate, which was a huge jump in implementation for us, and we were very fortunate to have that non-consequential year for that. And now we are ready to do a standard setting. We'll talk about the meeting in just a minute, and hopefully the passing standard will be set at this meeting by this body. Back to you.
So we wanted to just share a little bit of data with you. That was the data that came into that standard setting study for their deliberation. So you can see on your slide there the data. So as Gay shared with you, all programs and all candidates in this past year engaged with all 3 cycles. And at that point on June 6th, we picked up that data and prepared it for the panel. So you can see in our numbers here, they don't quite line up, but that's because more candidates engaged and submitted cycle 1, and those were all scored. And then we had cycle 2 coming along in cycle 3. A point to make is that these cycles could be done in any order. The design team did develop them with a sort of growth mindset, saying, start here with data and move on to working with communities of learners and move on then to working with an individual volunteer teacher. And so you can kind of see, but we still had robust numbers, and that is the data at which we had scored everything, and that data came forward to the standard setting panel. Of course, now at this point in time in July, our numbers are much higher, and we have slightly over 2,000 candidates in total this year that have engaged in the work, and the work is still, the submissions are still coming in, and they're still being scored as we speak, so it's an ongoing process. But for the standard setting study, these were the numbers of submissions that we had to look at.
A little bit about the structure of the Cal APA. There are 3 cycles within the Cal APA. Each one of them addresses a specific responsibility that is unique to an educational administrator in California schools. There's a recursive cycle you can see from the graphic on this slide. Candidates are asked to investigate current standards or current practices at a particular school, then set forth a plan of action addressing that need that they researched, act upon that plan, and then finally reflect both on their own individual growth and in some cases the growth of a group or an individual volunteer. So this recursive cycle repeated helps them guide their way through each of the cycles. Leadership Cycle 1, which is entitled Analyzing Data to Inform School Improvement and Promote Equity, asks candidates to become equity-driven leaders by developing a plan to implement a specific strategy on an educational need that they have pre-identified. First, they examine data sets that exist through the California dashboard, sites like the Department of Education, things like that. And then secondly, they determine their own qualitative data. I always get those confused. Quantitative data by doing their own research and further delving deeper into the educational need that they have identified. The third step, they develop a strategy to address that need and then go to an administrator above them at that school site to propose the plan. The administrator then gives them feedback. They adjust the plan, and then in step 4, they reflect on their growth through looking at data, trying to have an informed, data-driven decision to help school improvement and provide equity at that school. Leadership Cycle 2, which is entitled Facilitating Communities of Practice, asks a candidate to demonstrate their leadership with a very small group of educators. First, they do the research to see what is currently being done around communities of practice at that school, and then they invite 3 to 5 educators to work with them in a particular area of need. They do their own group research, they come up with a particular group, a particular need, and a particular strategy. The group then learns the strategy, implements the strategy, and provides feedback to the candidate on their initial feedback from trying this new strategy to help school improvement. And then finally, the candidate reflects on their ability to lead a small group, as well as the feedback from the group themselves to them. And then Cycle 3, Supporting Teacher Growth, first requires a candidate to investigate the current practice of teacher observation at that school, and then to find a volunteer teacher who will engage with them in a coaching cycle. Together they plan, conduct, and reflect upon a volunteer teacher's classroom practice using the California Standards for the Teaching Profession as the measuring tool. And then at the end of the coaching cycle, the volunteer teacher provides feedback to the candidate on their coaching abilities, which is then used as part of the candidate's reflection, both on teachers' next steps for the volunteer and their own growth through this cycle.
So on the slide, we just wanted to give you a quick glimpse at what the rubrics look like, and they're available for you in your appendices. But they are 5-level analytic rubrics with very detailed language about what is expected in the evidence that is submitted for the rubric. Often rubrics have multiple pieces of evidence that are submitted. Assessors are trained to read the essential question and then start at level 3. Every construct situated under level 3 must be met in the evidence. And if it's not, the assessor is trained then to think about whether this candidate is a level 2 response, and if not quite level 2, then are they level 1? If in fact they meet all the constructs in level 3, then the assessor is trained to consider, is there enough evidence to meet all the constructs in level 4? And then perhaps the candidate has submitted enough evidence to meet not only all of 3 and all of 4, but all of 5. And if that were the case, then they would be given a score of 5. And we have studied these rubrics in depth. Heather will talk a little bit about some of that work and the inter-rater reliability of our assessors. We've trained over 150 or so assessors, and are continuing to train assessors from both K-12 and our faculty and others that support our administrative candidates. So we just wanted to make sure that you were aware that the pattern, if you think back to last month when we were here with you talking about the TPA, hopefully you're noticing how the structure of the assessment as well as the analytic rubrics has a similar appearance and in the way that they were designed. So speaking of that, we wanted to make sure that we talked a little bit about some of the differences between the two assessments and really pointing out how new this work is for our programs that are working with us and with the candidates. So if you think back to the TPA, the Teaching Performance Assessment, the commissions model, there are 2 instructional cycles. But in this assessment, we have 3. And they also both have their sets of 5-level analytic rubrics, and they're both centrally scored and all of that, so that we can really watch that reliability and build that validity as we go forward. So we just wanted to point out that in the teaching assessment, it's 1 class of students, and the teacher is, the preliminary teacher is in that class, and they are involved with those students and with those mentors. And in the APA, however, there are multiple levels of interactions that need to occur at the district level. And so districts need to really participate with institutions and programs at county offices and LEAs that are supporting our administrator development. And that relationship takes time to build. And it takes time to help everyone out there in our great state of California understand access issues, and that if you're having a candidate at your school, what that means and how you support them. So we wanted to make sure that we were clear about that difference. Also, there's the issue of video recording that comes along in 2 of the assessment cycles. So in cycle 2 and 3, there must be video of your ability to facilitate a meeting in a collaborative way, for example. And in cycle 3, you're videotaping your work with that voluntary teacher. So this is also new practice for our administrative programs. In the world of the TPA, 20 years ago, we launched these ideas, people grappled with them, they worked on them, and we've iterated in that cycle multiple times. Excuse me. And videotaping at the very beginning of that felt new and different, and it took a while to understand that practice and embrace that practice. We're finding that again in the APA world. It's taking some time to be able to think about how video, as an example of your performance, how that works and what that looks like, and to build that comfort level and that set of expertise that's needed around that. The other issues that we wanted to point out is just, this notion that when you are working at a school building for this preliminary administrative credential, you are then needing to understand the faculty there and the support teachers there, and you need to think about how they can work with you. And so you need to ask them to work with you. And so that, again, comes back to this understanding and this relationship that needs to be built between admin preparation programs, no matter where they're situated, and those districts in which those candidates are doing this embedded assessment work. And then that voluntary teacher as well, identifying that teacher needs to have a comfort level to let that new admin preliminary candidate coach them and practice coaching. And so again, understanding how those dynamics are going to work is taking some time and will take time. So we just wanted to point out a couple of those differences between the TPA work and the APA work, and just emphasize the fact that it takes time to embed performance assessment and support candidates in a way that will help bring practice forward, right, and change all of our understandings about how we work together. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it back to Gay, who's going to take you through the standard setting process itself and what happened with all that data and what brought it
The standard setting panel was, their names are included in Appendix D on page 22 of the item. They met the last week of June in 2019 to examine the submission results and determine a scoring recommendation for you to consider today. Included in this meeting were a number of our professional services division personnel who observed the process and familiarized themselves with the 3 cycles of the Cal APA. The purpose of the standard setting meeting was to provide the Commission with an informed recommendation for a passing standard from expert California educators. This panel consisted of Cal APA assessors, Cal APA design team members, county office administrators, mentors or coaches who had served in the Cal APA in the past year, and preparation program facility who worked with the cycles also. The method used was consistent with the method used with all the other examinations that we hold with the CTC. Prior to the meeting, each panelist received the cycle guides that have instructions for the cycles, the rubrics themselves, plus 9 submissions, 3 from each cycle. These were pre-scored for them, so they received the scores for these submissions, and they were able to review the materials and the scoring to gain exposure to the range of responses and apply that information to the activities once we got together. The meeting began with an orientation and a training session. This slide shows you the starting point where we gave them the context to think about a brand new beginning practitioner as an education administrator. What do you think they should know and be able to do? At what level should they be able to perform? And then the question underneath all of that was what score, the sum of all the rubrics for each cycle, would you consider to be compensating for the beginning administrator? After the orientation, training, and the initial review, the panel members completed a series of activities as to what the potential cut score should be for that minimal level of knowledge, skills, and ability of a beginning practitioner. During this facilitated session, the panel members gained a deeper knowledge of the assessment and the information data that was contained in their briefing book. They participated in a number of policy capture activities, which are explained to you on pages 24 through 26 of the item. And after extensive discussion and examination, they individually put in their recommendation for a score for each cycle, and then we reviewed them as a team. And Heather.
Great. Thanks, Gay. Good morning, everyone. So this data shows now that we've gotten some input from the panelists and their recommendation visually where their final recommended passing standards would lie. And so as Gay was describing, we don't lead with the data, we lead with actual exemplars of performance. And that's the goal, is to work with the panelists at actual different ranges of performance to then ultimately make a recommendation for each of the cycles independently as to where they would say that the beginning administrator, new administrator, what level of performance they would expect from that type of candidate. And so for this is on page 7 of the agenda item. This frequency distribution shows you the distribution of scores for cycle 1. Cycle 1 has 8 rubrics, so it has more points possible to obtain than on cycles 2 and 3. And on the bottom there, it shows you the total score obtained, and then on the other axis, you've got the number of candidates that have obtained that score. On this cycle 1, the recommendation from the panel was a total score of 19 on an 8 rubric cycle. The arrow shows the panelist recommendation at 19, and in this scenario, everybody at the arrow and to the right would pass the assessment. That represents an 86% pass rate on this particular cycle. This cycle, as Amy pointed out, had the highest number of candidates, 1,385. And that recommendation of 19 on cycle 1 would result in 1,194 of those candidates passing, which is 86%. On the next slide, we have cycle 2. same visual. And you can see where, visually it kind of shows you, okay, if everybody to the right of that arrow is passing, the folks to the left are not passing. And that arrow actually does represent, in these cases, a large shift from 1 point just below that recommended passing standard and right at the recommended passing standard. So in this case, cycle 2, we're now on a 7 rubric metric, so fewer points possible. The recommended passing score of 17 from the panel. You can see the dip. If you were to go 1 score to the left at a score of 16, fewer candidates obtained that score. But at a cut score of 17 for cycle 2, which had 975 candidates completing that cycle, 775 would pass, which is 79%. And then finally, cycle 3, the final recommendation from the panel on this one, again, a 7 rubric metric, and the cut score recommendation was a score of 17, just like cycle 2. And in this case, 906 candidates took cycle 3, 810 would pass at a cut score recommendation of 17, which is 89%.
And then looking on page 9 of your item, table 2 looks at the responses for the panelists for their final recommendation score. So for cycle 1, the final panel recommendations, remember, this is the one that had the 8 rubrics instead of 7, so there's more points possible. A final cut score of 19 points was the median recommendation. And you'll see in the table on the right-hand side, they all voted for that one, so it was very easy to come to that median score. And the average, the left-hand side table talks about the 18 panelists, and the median here is very easy with the 19. We had one recommend a side condition that we allow a rubric score of 1 on one of the cycles, and another panelist thought there should be 2 allowances of a score of 1 on any 2 of the rubrics if they had the meeting score still of 19. For cycle 2, with 7 rubrics, the lesser total points available, the final cut score was 17 as a median score. From our panelists, you'll see there was just a little bit more divergence there in the scores on the frequency of the ratings. And this time we had one person who recommended a side condition, the single allowance of a score of 1 on a rubric with a passing score of 17 still being obtained. And then cycle 3, it was a mirror of cycle 2. The 7 rubrics, they recommended the median score of 17 for a passing score. And again, one panelist recommended that we allow a score of 1 on one of the rubrics.
Okay. So as is practice with all of our standard settings that we've brought to the commission, we always calculate a standard error of measurement. And we did talk about this with the panelists when we met with them. The standard error of measurement does represent that every measure does have error. And so a candidate's repeated test-taking performance, you would not expect them to get exactly the same score over repeated testing. So we calculate a standard error of measure based on the panelist's recommendation and the total points possible. That's those calculations are in Appendix F. And roughly it is 3 points for a standard error measurement for each of the cycles. So what we presented for you is the consideration of taking the panel recommendation and applying either a portion of or a full standard error of measurement, which would, in thinking about setting a cut score, encompass folks that are just below the cut who may on a repeated attempt actually be above the cut, but we don't want to have a false negative in there, right? Somebody who was told that they failed, but they actually, their true score would be a passing score within that standard error of measurement. So the idea is, if you think about that visual, we want to put a little bit of a error band around that recommendation of the cut score to be sure that the people who are just below that cut score or just above that cut score, those considerations are taken into account, especially when rolling out a new assessment in a consequential year. So the calculation, what we did was we took from the panel discussion, we asked them to tell us if they would recommend a standard error measure be applied as part of their final recommendation. So not only did they give us those total score values of 19, 17, and 17, they did make recommendations about applying either a full standard error measure or a partial standard error measure. Some of the reasons why they did that was because we had a wealth of data to look at, and what we saw was that performance, as I talked to you about passing, percent passing, that was not the same performance of passing standard across each ethnicity group or gender group. And so that's where we got into a discussion around a standard error of measure, taking into account some of those differences. So the panel discussion and the recommendation, that is outlined for you in your agenda item. Each of the SEM recommendations were cited on pages 15 and 16. So we just want to be sure that you take into account not just the total score recommendation coming from a panelist, but also many recommendations around applying either a half or a full standard error measurement and to particular cycles. I'm just going to walk through the tables that we have here on page, if we could go to page 11 of the agenda item. Because there's 3 cycles, what we wanted to do was look at what would be the combined pass rate of candidates who took cycles 1, 2, and 3, if we took the panel recommendations and if we looked at adjustments through a standard error of measurement. So and it's kind of hard to think about because it's a 3-dimensional thing, right? Cycle 1, 2, and 3. So what we did was we put on table 11, page 11, I'm sorry, it says table 3. This is if cycle 1 cut score is at 19, which is the panel recommendation. And along the top here, you have the cycle 3 cut score. And along the left-hand first column, you have the cycle 2 cut score. So what we want to do is say fix cycle 1 at 19. And now let's look at the panel recommendation of cycles 2 and 3 at 17. And what you see is at the panel recommendation of 19, 17, and 17, you have a 66% pass rate, assessment pass rate. And this is reflected of the 635 candidates who took cycles 1, 2, and 3. Then what we did was we said, well, what would be the impact of an SEM adjustment? And so we move now to the next page, page 12, table 4. This says, well, if cycle 1, if we were to adjust that down, that recommendation down a half of an SEM, that results in a cut score of 17 for cycle 1. Now we want to do the same for cycles 2 and 3. So we present in this table, we look for cycle 2 in the left-hand column here at down a half an SEM would be a cut score of 15. And you can see in parentheses it's 0.5 SEM. And on cycle 3 along the top, it would also be 15. And at that combination of 17, 15, and 15, which reflects the half an SEM, 79% of the candidates who took all 3 cycles would pass. And we replicated that process looking at -1 full SEM, and then again with -1.5 SEM. So if we turn to page 13 of your agenda item, -1, this is table 6, sets a -1.5 SEM. Cycle 1 cut score is at a total of 14. Cycle 2, the first left-hand column here, is at a cut score of 12. And cycle 3 is at a cut score of 12. At a -1.5 SEM, 91% of the candidates who took all 3 cycles would pass. So part of the decision process is we wanted to look at, well, cycles 1, 2, and 3 independently, how did candidates perform by ethnicity group? These are presented on pages 14 and 15. And I'll just go through those to show you where we were at with each of the cycles. So table 7, cycle 1, at a cut score of 19. You can see that we have differing performance pass rates across the board here. We have 86% of folks who did not indicate an ethnicity. 80% Black would pass at cycle 1 cut score of 19, 93% Asian, 86% Asian, 83% Hispanic, 88% white, and 93% other. So we do not have the same pass rate across the board for every ethnicity group here represented. And that did lead to a lot of our discussion around potential adjustments. We've provided for you also on cycles 2 and cycles 3 the same level of information. You can see the asterisk number there, 17 in cycle 2. If you read across, we do have some varying pass rates here where, for example, white pass rate on cycle 2, 83% of those candidates, as compared to Black pass rate at 62% and a Hispanic pass rate at 79%. So this contributed greatly to the conclusion of our discussion on day 2, where the panels were not only making a recommendation of a total level of performance, but also a potential adjustment. So finally, table 9 on page 15. Again, asterisk cut score of 17. And you can see that there are some variations here in performance pass rates in terms of, for example, 87% Black would pass at a cut score of 17, 83% Hispanic, and 93% white. And I will say, we've paired this with the number of candidates, so you can see the white ethnicity was a larger group in this entire population here. So there are some N differences across the groups. Not all of them are the same number of candidates, but there were some significant differences here in performance as we outlined in the agenda item. So the significant performance differences we did see: cycle 1, white performance as compared to Black; cycle 2, Asian and Black and white and Black; and cycle 3, white and Hispanic and white and Black. And we thought that was important to be sure that the panelists were aware of that, because then we could take into consideration pass rates by ethnicity and potential adjustments. Amy?
So again, we wanted to make sure that the data was presented to you in the way it was to the panel, and the panel had many discussions about the impact, potential impact of this data. And along with that data, we came back many times to talking about how the programs are early in their implementation, and they're still learning how to embed these cycles in their programs and into clinical practice. And we always need to remember that in our pilot and field tests, we only had 23 of the 60 plus programs with us to practice. And so in this first year, this past year, where all cycles were required and all programs were required to participate, and we jump up to the 60 programs, if it was literally the first year that they were trying to grapple with the complexity of this assessment. So we want to really remember that 42 programs engaged in this assessment for the very first time this past year. Faculty needed time, and perhaps candidates needed more time. We also wondered a great deal and discussed with the panel about the impact of a non-consequential year. Mm-hmm. So while a non-consequential year brings that extra time, the word non-consequential creates a psychological setup in some minds about, well, if it's not consequential, then maybe I don't need to engage at my full 100% level. Who knows? Anyway, we don't know. That's the whole point here. We're new in the process. It was a non-consequential year, so candidates did not have to meet a passing standard. They did not have to pay, but they had to engage and they had to complete. So we discussed that for quite some time. And then finally, the complexity of these embedded assessments and helping districts in this very large state understand that all of a sudden here they felt, I'm sure it was all of a sudden, while we've been working on this for many years, that they needed at their school sites to make data accessible to our candidates, to explain to faculty why this person was asking to work with them, the coaching of that individual teacher. And so it takes time to build those relationships with districts. It takes time to present the concept of this type of embedded assessment, the notion that candidates can be supported, that faculty need to engage. We no longer are in an environment where it's a test and you're doing this by yourself on a particular day of the year. These stretch out over time, and you are to be supported in your effort to engage. And all of that understanding just takes time to build in the field. So we want to make sure, the panel talked quite a bit about all of these aspects of this new assessment and how it was probably impacting programs and candidates. And we certainly collected a lot of survey data from everyone, and we talked with our assessors as we grappled with all those rubrics and understanding. And we just want to, I can't say it enough, we're new in this process. So finally, the panel got to its decision, which was a really amazing set of discussions that we had. And they came up with still recommending 19 points as the cut point for cycle 1, 17 for cycle 2, and 17 for cycle 3, with that consideration to bring forward of an SEM to be applied. So then that put us in the position as staff with our technical contractor to continue to dig into this data and think about what was going on, given that we had some significant differences. So we requested some additional analysis to try and dig in and really look at what was going on and why was this happening. Was it something due to the cycles themselves? Was it something due to a particular rubric? Did it have to do, we asked candidates to submit lots of kinds of evidence. So sometimes it's a narrative and a written response to prompts. Sometimes it's a video of your practice where you then go in and annotate your practice. And just learning how to look at your practice, pick a clip and annotate it. This is an area we all need to be working on with our candidates, whether they're teachers or administrators. So we did that. We looked very carefully at the cycle-specific data. We didn't see a pattern or a trend across the demographic groups. Nothing came to the surface. We dug into and really looked at those rubrics for each cycle, and again, nothing came to the surface. It wasn't a particular rubric. It wasn't particularly tied to writing capacity. Some of our rubrics just look at a written narrative, so we could look specifically at those rubrics to see those scored distributions. Across the demographics, we really didn't. There was no pattern. There was no particular outcome that we could put our finger on and say, well, this is the situation, this is what's going on here. This is what's making the significant difference appear for this subgroup in our data set. We went on then and looked at program by program and thought a lot about where programs are located, what types of school settings administrators are engaging in. Was that maybe somehow making this more complex for some candidates than for other candidates? And again, it's a question we need to continue to study. It's a question we need to continue to grapple with. There wasn't a clear indication. While we had in our number of candidates that were significantly lower, many are in urban settings, over half of the candidates in that group. So, but the other, slightly less than half were kind of spread across the state. So again, nothing in particular really came to the surface. So we will continue to study this in great depth, obviously, as we go forward, because we need to understand why, for this particular subgroup, we see these significant differences, and we need to work with our programs, and we need to support our candidates. And we need to just think about the fact that this is early in its implementation, but we're well aware of it. I think one of the takeaways for me was just the luxury of finally having data that we can look at across the state, and that we can look at by program, that we can look at by rubric, and we can really drill down into performance to see what's going on. We had a very interesting conversation about the fact that in cycle 1 there's no video, but there's video in cycle 2 and cycle 3. And we talked about the impact of how you train assessors to look at video, to think about what happens potentially when you see candidates. Is that different than when you're reading a narrative? And again, I couldn't find a difference, but we couldn't find a difference in the way cycle 1 was scored versus 2 and 3. And remember, cycle 1 is our non-video. So I couldn't point to that. But we are certainly walking away with this with ideas in our minds about ways to address this regardless. For example, we will very much enhance our training around bias and really, as I said, carefully watch the data as it comes in for each submission window month by month. So with that being said, and wanting to be supportive of our programs and our candidates as we move into this first year, staff is making a slightly different recommendation than the panel's recommendation. And so I want to move into that section of the item. So what we are recommending for at least this next year, where we're moving out of that non-consequential, where you didn't have to meet the passing standard and you didn't pay, but you did have to complete, to a consequential year where you are paying and you must meet the passing standard, we're suggesting, at least for this next year, an SEM of negative 1.5 be applied to each cycle. And you can see that in the tables presented there in front of you for how that then brings us to a score of 14 for cycle 1, a score of 12 for cycle 2, and a score of 12 for cycle 3. And you can see in this table here in 10.6 that brings our pass rate up for the black subgroup to 81%. In addition, we're recommending that when we do have consequential data in this next year, that we do conduct a second passing standard study, and we come back to you with data. So we can see whether or not this pattern persists or things shift and change, because now we've had more practice, we've had more time, and certainly every program, remember, is getting their own data. And every program is looking at this data, we hope, and thinking about what their data looks like in up against that state performance average, and thinking about where they're falling in that work. And so hopefully taking action based on what they're seeing in their own data sets. So that is, again, can't iterate enough how much this is new, and we had all 65 of our programs with us. We also have, in addition, a growing set of programs out there. So we have 3 programs that are just about to start just supporting candidates and starting this work, and are brand new to the Cal APA and brand new to admin prep. And this will continue to go on, and we have ways to work with those programs, but we do need to keep in mind that not only for our current programs is this new practice, but we also are having programs joining us right now, and we need to give them time as well. So just to, again, come back, the recommendation at this point is 14 points for a candidate on cycle 1, 12 on cycle 2, and 12 on cycle 3, applying that 1.5 SEM. And in addition, no side conditions would be applied. So we are agreeing with the panel that we will not establish a side condition, and so a candidate can come to their 14 points in cycle 1 in any manner. So there are 8 rubrics, so you could get very high scores on some and very low scores on others and still meet the threshold. If the commission adopts the recommended passing standards with this applied negative 1.5 SEM, then of course we would let all of the programs know, and this passing standard would go into effect for all candidates who are engaging in the work as of June 1st of 2019 forward in this first year. And as I mentioned, we would then be back with you next spring with a new set of data from a second standard setting panel deliberation. So with that, I will turn it back to you.
Thank you, Amy. When you said 4 years, I turned around and looked at Commissioner Hind and I said, has it been 4 years?
It has been.
Wow, we could have 2 toddlers.
Yes, yes. It's been a great journey.
She does. That's amazing work that you have done. We're going to open up for public comment, and we have 3 public comments. Janet Davis, if you would please. Oh, you are, okay. John Barba, if you would please come up and state your name and affiliation.
Good morning. My name is John Borba, and I'm professor of school administration at California State University, Stanislaus. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to share with you my thoughts about the test scores, cutoff points, First of all, I wish to I support the staff recommendation that's in the attachment here. The staff recommendation that the Commission adopt the following as a passing standard for the Cal APA for the 2019-20 year, effective June 1st, 2019, Cycle 1, 8 rubrics, a final cutoff score of 14 points, Cycle 2, 7 rubrics, a final cutoff score of 12 points, and Cycle 3, 7 rubrics, a final cut of 12 points. Briefly, I just wish to share my reasons for supporting that recommendation. First of all, there are 72 districts in the service region for CSU Stanislaus. I've learned over the last 2 years that there are no two districts that have the same idea of how peer coaching should look, or communities of learning should look, or data analysis should look. And neither do institutions that provide the training. So it's going to take time for everyone to fall in line with the type of learning communities, peer coaching practices, data analysis practices that are outlined in the assessment. The problem here is that there are many sites, the site supervisors, it's critical that they're aligned. You know, their ideas are aligned with the assessment about how, for example, peer coaching looks. To say, of course, all of us need to be on the same page. That will take time to get everyone on the same page so that we can effectively prepare students for success on this assessment. Secondly, there's been changes to the test each year, excellent changes. The committees that have been involved with that have revised the test each year to upgrade it, but it's still far from perfect. And I'm sure there'll be future revisions made, adjustments, and that's great. The thing is, the changes they're not released to the institutions that provide the training until summertime. And in order to be ready for the new school year in July or August, we're in a rush. And obviously, being in a rush, we do not prepare as well as we could. We do get it done. But that's something, right now we're making revisions to our curriculum, our syllabi, because of the changes to the assessment, the changes for this year. Another thing, instructors will need time to make this change, to make this transition. For example, in the CSU Stanislaus program, we have at least 30 part-time instructors in the school administration program. It's going to take time to get them prepared. And I appreciate all of the workshops that the CTC will be providing this coming academic year to help us prepare, to do the best we can preparing candidates for the assessment. Another thing is that, there's something else I want to say, just that, once again, time is critical. I know a lot of time has been put in terms of getting to where we are, but there will still be a lot of time required to successfully make this transition. For those reasons, I support the staff recommendation. I agree with Amy that this is a very complex test. I think it's an excellent test, but it's complex and we need time. And thank you.
Thank you. Peg Winkleman, Capea.
Peg Winkleman, California Association of Professors of Educational Administration. I'd like to take a moment to build upon the comments of Chair Sloan and Executive Director and the vision described. as leaders every day, some would argue every moment of every day, we're faced with decisions in terms of moving forward. And there's often an efficient, easy proposal at hand, which is often continuing current practices and getting current outcomes. And then there's the more difficult option of examining underlying causes and moving a whole community forward. So an easy example of that is suspend a kid, blame him, or look at a whole community and how you're going to change the structures and promote more positive outcomes. For instance, restorative justice, PBS, et cetera. Actually, it was more than 5 years ago that this commission took the harder road. And I'm here on behalf of COPIA to commend you for taking the harder road. There was an option of adopting a test from another state and just modifying it, moving forward. And what this commission had in mind was actually the notion of better preparing leaders who would better support the students of California. So this is a moment of commendation for that. With that in mind, as leaders, I'm looking over at Gay and Amy and Dr. Sandy. We know how difficult that journey is. We know. We've done it. We study it, and we prepare our leaders to take this kind of journey on. And it involved going back and looking at the standards, at the California performance expectations, at the California content expectations, aligning with the capsule, coming in when we thought we were all said and done and say, wait, we need an equity preamble, which the commission immediately took forth, right? So that we framed all this work in terms of better serving the students of California, particularly those populations that are marginalized and currently underserved. So this begins with that commendation. With that in mind, we also commend this entire process. Like I said, more than 2 toddlers, I think, in this process, and the transparency in terms of looking at data and coming back to data. So particularly, I would like to just draw attention to page 14 and the discrepancy in the data in cycle 2. As you have heard and read at numerous meetings, cycle 2 was a cycle of concern for many of our COPIA members in terms of the task. And what we'd like to offer, as Amy was describing, grappling with and studying this, is our expertise as an organization. This is what we do. We study this, and we would be more than happy to engage with you as you grapple. So moving forward, we assume that would then come into the discussion of standard setting after you get another set of data this year. And we would like to, first of all, again, recognize and appreciate the partnership as community members with CTC staff and the commission, and strongly support the staff recommendation for the cut scores.
Thank you. And those were our 2 public comments. I'd like to thank the public comment for supporting the staff's recommendation. That's very comforting, especially based on Commissioner Sloan opening this morning. And I'd also like to say, I didn't want to say this before public comment, but when I was on the National Board of Directors, we worked on something like this, and it was NB, National Board Certified Educational Leaders, NBASOL, which was a lamentable name, and that could have foreshadowed what was to come. And with, we had, people from all over the country working on this, and it never got this far. And so as I was reading this and listening to you, I know that it was a lot of work, and seeing the committee members, I have a lot of confidence in the people who are on this committee. So I really appreciate everything that you've done so thoughtfully and so considerate of the stakeholders, and looking at, what we want to see in our schools as we move forward. So that was my commissioner comment. Any other commissioner comments? Yes, Commissioner Alavi.
So I may be the only one who's a little hesitant here because, and I'm also working off of our last meeting where we also had to deal with cut scores. We employ this blue ribbon design team, and then we don't follow their recommendations, and staff comes up with another recommendation. I'd like to ask whether or not you have a chance to go back to the design team and then talk to them about your recommendations.
So one part that we didn't get very specific about here is that the standard setting study saw the data by cycle. And so I'm going to turn it over to Heather to talk a little bit about what happens post standard setting study when we do that secondary set of analyses and why we got to and then I'll come back and talk about why we got to this staff recommendation and why we wouldn't just take their expert.
Sure.
Yeah.
So, and one of the points that was discussed on day 2 was the consideration around a standard error measure, and so those were tabulated and listed in the agenda item where most panelists did recommend an adjustment. So they made their cut score recommendation with that caveat of not a side condition, but more of an introductory adjustment. And so this staff recommendation is true to that idea of still anchoring it in the panel recommendation, but adjusting it using a statistical measure that is defensible and is actually practice in all commission considerations around standard settings. But as far as what Amy was mentioning, we brought for the panel cycle level considerations, but our responsibility is then to also look at, well, what about people who took all 3 cycles? They may pass one, but not another. What happens to them? So that's the additional analysis we did, not only as a whole of all of the candidates, but then breaking it out by demographic group. That's something on, and I'll just point to the page because it's not something that the panelists saw, but on page 17, that's what we wanted to look at was the panelists didn't have this information. We were not looking for them to solely make their judgment based on a passing rate, but more anchoring it in levels of performance for each cycle. So afterwards, as part of our exploration of the data, as outlined on page 17, we said, well, it's our responsibility to look at the combined performance of these candidates by ethnicity and what the impact is of adjusting each of the panel recommendations by a portion or full standard error measure. Amy, do you want to add it?
All right. So as we looked at this data on page 17, and we start at our 19, 17, and 17 recommendation, and we look at that significant difference of only 50% of our African American candidates passing, the impact of that, given the newness of this work, and given that we could not really identify what was causing that, to leave it at that level seems to be unsupportive, frankly. And so that was what was driving our decision making then as staff. How do we set a standard or make a recommendation to set a standard so that candidates across subgroups can have that time and opportunity to engage with the work, but not be held back because maybe there is some kind of error that we're not accounting for in some way. So as we go from the recommendation of 19 and 17 with no cut score, with no side condition, and we continue to look at that as we adjust for that SEM all the way up to negative 1.5, we get to 80% passing, which drove our conversation. And because we have this significant difference, and because our assessment design standards tell us that we must understand what's driving a significant difference, the way for us, one way for us, and the way we're putting it in front of you, is for this consideration really of another year of time to embed this assessment, to work with all of our candidates. As I said, every one of our programs receives this data just as we do. Our hope is that they're looking at that data seriously and that they are also thinking about at the program level, what is this data telling me about my candidates? What's happening? And how can I address this potential significant difference in performance? Like, what is it about my program for my candidates? What's perhaps something I could do more of? What's something I could change? How can I reach out to these candidates? Who's coming into my program? How are they getting in my, all of these program level questions that really need to be addressed. People just need more time to think about it. So, I wish we could be very specific with you about why we think this is happening, because then we could go right there and fix it. But right now, we're just not seeing a pattern across the cycles or across any of the particular rubrics or in how we're thinking about this. So really, in some ways, it goes down to the program level for that next deeper look at candidate performance and to just think about what to do to support every candidate who's in our program. We started out by saying teachers teach every child. Well, in our programs of preparation, we should be preparing every single candidate that comes into our programs and thinking about what we do to do that. So that's why staff made it different.
Well, I appreciate that, and I'm certainly willing to give everybody a working year to figure it out. But I also reflect that these are candidates who are going to be our leaders, and they come with experience to this test. They don't usually take this test until after many, many years of experience, and therefore it's a different set of candidates who I look at. And when they come to our school districts, I want to be assured that those candidates have mastered at least the preliminary levels of leadership that this test is supposed to assure us that we did. And I was concerned that the 5-point difference that you're asking for really pushed that score down quite a bit. So while I can appreciate everybody wanting to get the experience to handle this and prepare for this, I will really be looking next year to see whether or not you can back that up. So I appreciate that.
The other thing I just want to remind us all of is that this assessment is one measure of many when a candidate comes into a program. So it's also, it's how a candidate performs on this new assessment, but it's all down to those rubrics, but it's also how are they engaging in the program, in the coursework, and in their performance there. And when you put those things together, then is that program ready to make a recommendation?
Right.
So that may
Thank you.
help your thinking.
Commissioner Wall?
So first, I think that the amount of technical work done here is impressive. And I want to give two contexts. I mean, one with actually a lot less data than we saw 2 months ago. Because while there's a significant amount, there is actually less than with the teachers. Secondly, you've gone a little bit further in your analysis, which I truly appreciate. So from a technical side, I think you've dug a little deeper, and I think that should be recognized. Then I want to comment that there's a lot of tension in the field about this. The private institutions certainly are very concerned. Many people feel like they are, in fact, in their first cycle. And even though they may be in their first cycle, that means that at any institution, the number of people who have participated is small. Let me give my own institution's example. There's a small number of people who participated, and while the coordinator of that program attends to every single person's results, it really is not enough data on an institution level to say much meaningfully about how there should change or evolve the program, right? Because there just isn't yet enough participants in a disaggregated fashion. And then I think the question about, and I am going to use the word potential bias in the exam, is a very substantive question. And given that, we saw 2 months ago that we didn't actually see these results on descriptive analysis with the Cal TPA, and then to see these, I think, is a really substantive question, which makes the recommendation really prudent. Because I think that, we could open ourselves up to, a lot of concern about the exam, and I think giving that time and really looking at the data again with more information is a really strong recommendation, and I appreciate the work tremendously that's been done.
Yes, Commissioner Francois, and then Commissioner Hind.
I echo everyone's appreciation for the thoughtfulness and hard work that went into this, and also everyone's acknowledgement of the passing rates based on ethnicity. And this is hard stuff, right? And I think that if this exam is framed around and focused on equity, then we need to dig deep into any equity concerns that surface based on the data. And so your efforts to do that are not only commendable, but almost required for us to do this right. And so I also really appreciate the fact that you're going to drill down deeper into this, and I really look forward to hearing what you find out. I want to echo Commissioner Wall's recommendation around bias, but I also think there's another bias that comes into play on these kinds of assessments that include videotape, particularly around ethnicity and language. And while you haven't yet found any correlation at all, I would keep that in play. We had a deep discussion about this when we were designing the Cal TPA and using videotape rather than written responses. And either way, there's going to be some bias. If you're a good writer and you don't have to worry about the videotape, you're going to score better. But looking at this ethnic breakdown, it really concerns me that there might be something there around scores and the videotape. The other thing that I want to put on the table is that, Amy, you mentioned in multiple times in multiple ways how long this takes. Programs are in transition. This is new to us. We're learning. And it does raise the question to me about whether or not then we're ready to make this consequential. If we're at a point right now where there's data showing that there's something going on here, we're not quite certain what it is, but we definitely know there's something going on. Programs are scrambling to respond and become educated about this and change their programs, with which Dr. Barba mentioned. Barba mentioned. Are we really ready to make this consequential for everyone? And is that fair? And if we do, I'd be interested to know what kinds of supports we are giving to programs to help them make this transition efficient and effective.
Commissioner Hind?
Thanks. I really appreciated the comments at the table, and Amy, thank you so much for your clarification for that last piece. I think that really helped everybody understand just kind of how the process works. A couple of things I wanted to address. Another thing that when you're saying we don't know what's causing the differences, I've been doing the Cal APA for the past year. I've been in the process of it. There are certain things that are coming up like access, and not just access to resources, access to actual schools to do the work in. So if you're not in a typical setting, you have to look for it outside of what everybody is expecting you to already have. Or if you're full-time teaching, where do you find the time to spend going in depth with coaching? So there's just different levels of access that I don't think are really being addressed or haven't been thought about. Or if you're in a very rural district and you don't have more than 4 teachers at a site, how do you get a group of 5 to 8 teachers to work with? So just pieces like that that aren't really being discussed but are very important and are affecting people's ability to do the work. Secondly, the point you just brought up about are we ready for another or are we ready for a consequential year? And I think what it comes down to is money. Really, realistically, we don't have, it's very expensive to do a non-consequential year. And without breaking the commission's bank, I think we have to do something. And so I think it's really important to have the final cut scores be realistic enough. They may seem low. And actually, probably 5 years ago, I would have said, no way. I would have been right there with Commissioner Olivey, and I would have said, this is way too low. What kind of people are we trying to put in our classroom or in our school sites? But it does make a lot of sense. We need to figure out what's causing the low scores for some subgroups. We need to figure out what pieces we haven't thought about. We need to figure out how to fix this assessment so that it actually shows us what we're trying to see if our future administrators know and are able to do. And you only have to teach for 5 years before you can go to become an administrator. So not all people coming into this program have many, many years of experience. And it is a learning curve because you could be in a classroom for 20 years and you're asked to do things in the administrative programs that you've never done before, including leading meetings and coaching other teachers, your peers, your friends. So that's something important to remember too. And I had one more point, but I can't remember it. So I am in support of this, and when we are ready, I will move that.
Yes, Commissioner Hartwig, and then Commissioner Jackson.
Thank you to everybody for your really in-depth work on this. I just had a couple of questions. One is a follow-up on the comments about whether we're ready for a consequential year and My question related to that was just to get a realistic sense from the staff of, is a year going to be enough time for you to see a change in the many different factors that make us not ready right now? So both in terms of understanding the data, but also in terms of program preparation that we've heard. Could you just give us a frank assessment of how many of those major changes you think we're going to be able to see within a year?
So here is my assessment, and then I want to turn it to Gay, who has really spent over a decade working very closely with our set of programs and our new programs coming in and the programs that aren't quite open yet, and so our number shifts around, but it's 60-ish programs, quite a number. In the first couple of years, and working with our pilot and field test programs, it was sort of like shock and awe. You know, it was very, we needed to introduce some ideas around performance-based assessment that really were new. And with that comes change, and with change comes, a sort of disequilibrium in the force, so to speak, and everyone needs to kind of pull up their chair to the table and figure out what to do. And conversations need to be had that maybe haven't been had for a while, and outreach to districts have to happen, and all of that takes time and is difficult. But I will tell you, this spring we had our first implementation conferences where statewide we pulled faculty together to talk about best practices and share best practices. And we also had our, we asked programs to identify a coordinator for every program to be our kind of conduit of communication between our technical contractor and the commission and the program. And there was really a sea change, I would say, in the room. A lot more comfort on the part of people that spent the day with us and gave us their time. A lot more positive, sort of celebratory kind of conversations, like, we made it, we got through, we learned a lot, we got our data, it wasn't as difficult as we thought it was going to be kind of conversations, but still lots of very in-depth conversations about how to improve the system, how to tighten up the language, how to look for alignment, how to define vocabulary. So it was, to me, very different in the last couple of face-to-face meetings that we got to have with the community. So I think that there was a lot of learning that happened this year, and I do think that we are in a position where, moving forward with the proposed standards, that will change, that we will come back with data. Well, I don't know, I don't have a crystal ball, but we will study it and we will change as we go, I guess is my promise. And we can't have an assessment that has these kinds of significant differences. So we must address it and we must figure out what's going on. So we will do that. And as I said, there are certain things we're already going to do, like really looking at our bias training and really thinking about that training and how we're working with our assessors around that, carefully watching the differences between the way scores are assigned to candidates in cycle 1 versus 2 and 3, where we do have video. So in a way, we have a nice little control group there to study. I think a lot of it is building these relationships with districts and how we get access for candidates to that data and other colleagues that will work with them. So that's my 2 cents on that. I think that really, for me, at least my perception was that we have come a long way, and the level of comfort and understanding is much more at a point of people feeling not overwhelmed, but feeling like we can do this. So that would be my take on it. Gay, what would you say?
The amount of change has been tremendous. John Borba came to the table not too long ago and said, would you please stop the changes? Just give us time to catch up, please. And we're hopefully at that point. I remember 5 years ago we held think tanks thinking about this before it was an entity to do yet. And the dean at Notre Dame de Namur encouraged everyone in the room to become a piloter, become a field tester, because that was the way you could embrace and do the change over time. We had 23 of 60 programs do that. So the amount of change for them, they're our veterans. They're the ones who have taken our hands and collaborated with us, and along with organizations like CAPIA have made some great changes. But we have 40 of them out there who haven't. And that was a huge increase in time. We see a lot of growth in abandoning what used to be signature assignments as the assessment piece and turning it over to problem-based learning with the Cal APA. That has been a short-term change for some and a long-term change for some. And then to disseminate it through all of the faculty was very large this year as well. And we have had structures. We will continue to have structures to help them out. We're adding a faculty training. This year we have office hours every single week. We continue to have virtual think tanks online monthly, as well as face-to-face. So everything we can with help of our veterans in the field. So the challenges are there, yes, but I think we've made great strides.
Commissioner Jackson. Oh, I'm sorry, I had one more, another question. And that has to do with the use and operation of the SEM for this assessment. And this is I guess a bit of an education question for me, but I do think that it's important if we're going to be relying on the SEM as how we're going to be adjusting the assessment for this coming year versus actually changing what the standard number is that we are setting. Could you explain to me, is there a little bit more about how an SEM works vis-a-vis something that's a performance assessment versus a single point in time exam? I think I understand SEMs used for single point in time exams, but I'm not sure I really understand what it means when you're applying it to a performance assessment, which is meant to capture a much longer period of performance and indeed hopefully to evade some of the issues that we have for single point in time exams that would require a serious SEM.
Sure, and this exam this exam requires human judgment, right, from assessors on a level of performance. We monitor those assessors to ensure that we do have a reliability there between how accurately they are scoring something. So whether that's giving them something that has been pre-scored and seeing how accurate they are on that validity or calibration set helps us to monitor our scorer quality. So standard error measurement takes into account here that the error in that measurement, in this case for a human judgment-based assessment with this number of points available, it is at 3 points with an SEM. So making that statistical adjustment takes into account the fact that you're acknowledging there is some error here in judgment, an error in measure from the assessors. And in the candidate, if they were to retake it again, you could expect a score that is within that. If the cut score is 17, you have a kind of an error band around that. So the standard error measurement allows you to defensively adjust a panel recommendation up or down, however you may want to do it, to take into account those folks that may be just below or just above the cut score using a statistical measure rather than just looking at numbers and saying, I'm looking for pass rates. And so that's what we're looking at here is applying that statistical measure. And when I reference the other standard setting activities for the commission and the SEM being brought forward, those are typically on a combination of multiple choice and open response type examinations where the standard error measurement is also considered there in terms of the panel recommendation and whether or not that should be adjusted by the statistical measure. So that's why we have always brought that forward as part of a standard practice with considering it. Did that address your question?
Yeah, it does. I mean,
Okay.
I think it sort of means that in this case, we're really thinking about the error being more a result of potentially the assessor's participation in it.
I think we're trying to pinpoint what the sources of error may be.
Got it. Okay.
Right? And so, but we also know that the candidates, there is error in that measure that you wouldn't expect them to come back the next day and get the same, or to submit this assessment again and get the exact same score, given that we see our exact agreement rates for rubrics it's not 100%. if you and I were scoring the same thing, it's more like 40% of the time we're going to exactly agree on a common score on a rubric on a 5-point scale. We may be very close to each other in terms of how accurate we are. Adjacent is what we call it in the scoring process, but it's not commonplace to have 100% agreement across our assessors. Yeah.
Upwards of potentially close to 20 pages of text that are pinned to particular prompts and narratives around investigation and those 4 steps of planning, acting, and reflecting. We're looking at multiple constructs. We're looking at multiple CAPEs that we're trying to measure. We're doing it across modalities because there's writing and there's videotape and there's annotation of videotape and then there's reflection on your practice. And so at each of these steps, you could be doing really well in one step and then not well, like maybe you're just not very reflective about your practice yet because you are a new practitioner and you don't know what's good and what's bad. So how do you be right? When you put all of that together, and then you try and train assessors who are also coming from a huge array of settings and and many different philosophies about this work in the first place. And as we began to even understand in some of our 2-day assessor trainings where we really changed our model because they need to look at many, many submissions and talk about them and understand them before we even ask them to try and calibrate. That was a big learning curve from pilot year to field test year. We had to completely change the way we trained and calibrated assessors. That being said, the more of these submissions you read, the better you understand the rubrics and the more calibrated you become. So with all of that in place and thinking about the fact that not only for our candidates, it's been a long time since really we've set at that preliminary level clearly what is the CAPE expectation for performance. We needed to help our assessors even understand some of these complex ideas around coaching, for example. So given all that, from my perspective, after the beginning of this 4 years ago and now, I feel like we're actually in a great place, except for this significant difference that we really have to dig into and understand. So in the big picture, we've made huge progress. We have to allow for this SEM adjustment, I think, given the data set we got and given the fact that this non-consequential year introduced error that none of us can put our finger on. It is... it would not be wise to take this data set and think that it was really representative. It is sort of representative, I guess, at best, given the complexity of the assessment itself, the complexity of training the assessors, the complexity of monitoring that data, and then having that yet a new set of practitioners come to work with us on the standard setting, where discussions came up that certainly were aligned to discussions with the design team from the first 2 years, but new things emerged. And they emerged in such a way that we actually went back again after that standard setting study and revised the cycles, some of the language in the cycles, particularly in cycle 1, interestingly enough, around this issue of whether or not a bias from a candidate should or should not interact with rubric decision making. This is a huge issue. The fact that it didn't come up until our standard setting study was, I think, my guess is that we didn't have submissions to look at. And in this kind of work, until you have actual responses from candidates across a wide array of programs, you don't really understand or see performance. So once we were able to really look at that and then talk with yet another panel of experts, it brought us to yet another understanding of something we needed to make sure we were addressing. So we've now done that as we come into this new year. So I think it's better to grapple with the complexity of making these changes and bringing them forward, even if it feels like it's a little late to programs, than not doing anything about it. And so we're in that complex work. And so anyway, it's a long explanation, but I think we are okay to move forward in your first question, that really the level of comfort has changed dramatically. With many practitioners coming to us in those final June workshops saying, we had our doubts, but we do think this is what administrators should know and be able to do. And so we appreciate that these types of requirements for evidence are in these assessment tasks. Now, it's not easy to get there, but we do agree that this is what should be happening with our our training of preliminary administrators.
Commissioner Jackson, and then Commissioner Barnes, and then Director Sandy.
Yes, I really appreciate all of the comments from my fellow commissioners and explanation on the process. There was concern at the department about the panel recommendation versus the staff recommendation, and so I think that's been pretty cleared up here. And I really appreciate the fact that you're really going to study, and try to get to the bottom of why there are discrepancies, in the various groups. As you know, the superintendent is really, one of his initiatives is trying to get more people of color into the profession, not just as educators, but also as school leaders. And we really need to be vigilant on what's going on in those areas. So appreciate that.
So this is such a rich conversation, and I think, and it's complex, and I appreciate Dr. Winkleman's recognition that 5-6 years ago, when the commission decided which way to go, we chose the harder path, and for every good reason, because we weren't just looking for a stamp, we were looking for an educative assessment for every single person who enters preparation, something that by virtue of doing it, you are learning to do the job that you're going to be certified to do. That's a hard target. It really is, for all the reasons we've discussed here. And two very important things are coming out at this table. First, we do not want to have an undue impact on any population, and we most certainly do not want to impact diversity in this workforce in a negative way. And so that's I think, an absolute given. At the same time, our school board member puts it very clearly, and I so appreciate your kind of constant bringing this back. We need well-prepared, well-qualified people to lead our schools. We need both of these things to coexist. So the data that you're looking at comes from a population of people who have never done this before. This is the first time we have ever had data like this for any cohort of people coming through a preparation program. They did it in a year where for 2/3 of the program, this was the programs that we accredit, this is the first time they'd ever tried to build these kind of assignments into their coursework and support people doing it. A lot of first-time stuff here. So back to the question of could we consider another non-consequential year? I think that, well, what's clear is that 2 years ago, we sought funding in our budget and received an augmentation in our budget to pay for a non-consequential year. Basing that assumption on, if candidates are going to participate in this and we're going to learn from them, we shouldn't charge them extra for that experience, right? We should invest in the learning that we needed to do and the opportunity they were going to give us to do standard setting. And that may have had some impact on how seriously people took it. We don't know, really. But this set of scores reflects that. And I think, Commissioner Hyde, you've said also, there is a financial aspect to this, and to ask candidates to go through this so we can learn some more at their expense. I think we may have some precedent here about how we do that. That said, if you look again at table 10.6 on page 17, and the population that took this past year, where 2/3 of their programs had never done this before, we saw an overall pass rate of 91%. That's pretty high. Based on the staff recommended passing standard, we would have seen a 91% pass rate for people doing this for the very first time in programs that had never done it. We see that there is a differential, a 10-point differential for the African American community that sat for this, but we had an N of 58 in that population compared to the white population of 286. And Commissioner Wall, I think you mentioned this, that the N itself, is going to tell us more. The more people we have take this, the more we're going to learn about what norms of performance look like. So if you were to adopt the passing standard that staff is recommending to you, it's not the same as having a non-consequential year, but it's pretty close. I would expect that in a second year of running this, every program that ran it last year learned a lot, and they know where they're going to place more effort in order to increase their passing rates. The institutions whose African American candidates did not do well on this, I believe they're conscientious and they're going to take that seriously and figure out, what do we need to do? And if they aren't, just in case it's not on their radar screen, we're going to put it on their radar screen because we have institution level data, and this is a question we can't just be blithely look past. We must move forward on it. So I just wanted to encourage you that setting a low passing standard at the beginning is normal, especially when we're trying to do something this challenging. And to ramp up, to expect, and to anchor it to the passing standard that you expect as a school board member, and we all want to get to, is a good thing to do. It's a legitimate thing to do as a standards board, to set that standard out there and say we're going to build toward it, we're going to provide technical assistance to get there. This is all, I think, consistent with the direction that we have heard you'd like to go. So I just wanted to put some of that on the table to respond to some of the questions that came up.
Yes, Commissioner Sloan.
This was such a rich discussion. I don't think I really have much to add other than to acknowledge the thoughtfulness that went into everybody's questions and comments and all of the work that has been done here. But I did have maybe one or 2 points. One being that building off of what several people have said and Commissioner or Executive Director Sandy just stated, starting where we're starting is important for a number of reasons, and ramping up, as we said. The other thing to remind everyone of is that what was different when we were doing the standard setting for the Cal TPA was that we had a TPA in place already, and we couldn't go for any period of time saying we don't have a TPA ready to go, and but we did not have an APA assessment before this. So it is important that we do move forward with the work, but previously people were becoming administrators without doing an assessment such as this. The other thing I would say is the importance of learning from this work. We saw when we were back in the early days of the TPA, if this is a very good assessment for learning, programs are learning, candidates are learning, and we're all getting better. And we certainly saw that with the TPA, and we expect to see that with the APA too, particularly now that we know so much more about what we need to pay attention to as we look at outcomes. One of the things that in the program I ran that we noticed almost all the time, scores on the TPA triangulated in some way with other assessments in the program. If a candidate was struggling on the TPA, they were also struggling in other ways in the program. This is important information to get to around the APA to ensure that we're having alignment and triangulation of results. So something we can look at. So just to again acknowledge all of the hard work. This was a great item, and I'm really looking forward to seeing where this goes. And I am appreciating the balance between looking at who wants to become administrators and supporting their work. Also acknowledging that administrators who do not pass the first time can retake. They don't need to retake the whole thing. They just need to retake the cycle where they may need to improve. So I think that's important to remember too. All right, thank you.
Would somebody like to make a motion?
May I first just ask one clarifying technical question about the motion or the action that we can take? Are we able to set the standard for a circumscribed period of time, like this administration? Just, I know that we're going to have a lot of information brought back to us next year, but there might be some reassurance then about that we are committed to either reaffirming the standard that we had this year or changing it next year. Is that something that is that we can do? Are there reasons from staff why it would not be helpful for us to have it circumscribed just to this administration of the APA?
I think that's precisely what the staff would like to recommend, is that for this administration, we set this passing standard, but if you look at the last 2 lines there, we are recommending that we do another standard setting study, full standard setting study based on this administration, and bring that data to you to, again, consider the passing standard for the following year. And that's something we'll want to be looking at this data every year to see what the ramp looks like.
Thanks. I hadn't understood from that whether that was going to require another vote in a year or that was going to be more informational. But if that's already part of the package, then my question is moot. Thanks.
Commissioner Francois? Just very quickly before we move into a motion, and is number one, I'm wondering if we have, or I'd like to request, can I make a request? I'd like to request diversity data on the scores. I'm just curious. The other thing is I want to thank Executive Director Sandy for her final comments, because that makes it a little clearer and more encouraging in my mind. But I also would like to request that we all think about, yes, there are financial implications for the commission, but there are also financial implications for the students who are going to be taking these exams, having to pay for them, and if they fail, having to pay again. And if you want to increase the diversity of the administrative force, we're talking about Black and brown educators who are, many of whom are already in financial constraints. So my thoughts about the inconsequential year is that we need to think about, is it equitable to ask our students to pay for something that we're not quite sure is right at this time? I'm hearing in the conversation, and I actually like the exam, by the way, that we agree that this assessment is structured in a way and asks candidates to do the things that we think are most important for them to go into the field. But I still am very concerned that there seems to be many questions on this table based on the demographic data and the passing rate data, that we're asking them to take an exam that we haven't fully fleshed out the reasons why there's such variance in passing rates.
Okay, Commissioner Hind, would you like to make a motion?
I do. I really like the points that you just brought up. That's some information I hadn't thought about with the diversity of the scores. That was really important. I do want to move that we approve staff's recommendations as listed on the screen that I can't read from back here, but
that data be analyzed during the next.
Yes, so
preparation
as it's written, with outside conditions at this time, but to be looked at again in the spring with those point scores of cycle 1 at 14, cycle 2 at 12, and cycle 3 at 12.
Excellent. We have a motion. Do we have a second? All right. Commissioner Kuhn, seconds. All right, we'll now call for a vote. All those in favor, please say aye. Anyone opposed? Abstentions? Okay, motion carries.
Thank you.
Thank you again. All right. We're going to take a 7-minute break. See you back here at 11:07. Okay, so this is item 2B. The discussion of implementation issues relating to clinical practice for preliminary multiple subject and single subject credential programs. This item is being presented by Jake Schuler and Cheryl Hickey. This is an information action item. Ms. Hickey, will you please begin?
Sure. Good morning, Commissioners. This agenda item presents for you, for discussion purposes, some of the questions that staff has received from institutional personnel as well as accreditation team members about the preliminary multiple single subject program standard 3, which is about clinical practice. So for your reference throughout today's discussion, we've included Appendix A, which is the entire text of program standard 3. I'd like to start by talking about why this item is coming before you today for discussion and to clarify what we expect the outcome for the discussion will be, because we know that it was somewhat unclear in the item what the expectation would be. So first, I want to thank our Commissioner Chairperson. I think you set this up perfectly in terms of the tone and what we intend to do at this morning. The Commission adopted the new preliminary standards in 2016, and all preliminary multiple and single subjects programs were required to implement the standards by the fall of 2017. So programs have now had 2 academic years of working with these standards, and accreditation teams have used them as the basis for accreditation decisions. It's important to remember that currently there are 178 preliminary multiple and single subject programs in California, none designed exactly alike. So as it's touched upon in this agenda item, the current set of program standards are different in some really significant ways from the previous set of program standards. Those of you who were here at the time that these were adopted remember that their development and adoption was part of a larger, more comprehensive undertaking by the Commission, and Commissioner Sloan mentioned that. It was a project we referred to lovingly as the Strengthening and Streamlining Accreditation Project. And in essence, what the Commission was trying to do, just as a reminder, was to eliminate some of the onerousness from the Commission's accreditation system and from the standards, to allow greater flexibility and innovation in programs, while at the same time bringing some closer parameters around those things or those elements that we knew were demonstrated to be high leverage and essential practices. And then finally, to shift the balance away from a heavy emphasis on inputs to one that also considered program outcomes. So the idea was to give programs a bit more space in which to design and operate their program, but to hold programs accountable for whether or not their candidates were well prepared. So in carrying out this charge, the language of the standards that were adopted very much reflected this perspective. We went from 19 program standards down to 6, with a distinct set of teaching performance expectations that identified what candidates should know and be able to do. As the agenda item states, some of the language of the standards were made less prescriptive, giving institutions that flexibility, and some of the standards were more prescriptive, where the Commission believed that they needed to set a more explicit standard or floor. So back to why this item is before you today. We'd like you to think about this as a mid-course check on the system. We wanted to air some of these questions that we've been getting, have a discussion, and then think about this being able to go back to the field, continue the discussion, and maybe at some point in time be able to present you with possible options for addressing these. We are presenting a series of questions for you all to discuss for discussion purposes that really have come from the institutions themselves, staff or accreditation teams, where we've questioned whether the intent was really to be as specific or to be as flexible, and sometimes the intent of what the Commission intended. So your Commission staff has worked really hard to respond to the many questions over the past few years about these new standards. We've issued a guidance document clarifying the things that we believe that we're on really solid ground, but staff's interpretation of some of these can only go so far. And when push comes to shove, it really is the standards that have to communicate the intent of the Commission. So the agenda item presents 3 options for future actions on page 3 and 4, and again at the end on page 11, to maintain the language of the standard as adopted, to maintain the language of the standard but clarify where there may be more flexibility and the parameters of that flexibility, or to identify revisions of this standard to ensure consistency across programs. So I want to make really clear that we're not asking the Commission to make those decisions today, but rather eventually after gathering that additional input from the field. But we did want to hear from you today, and staff could eventually come back with another item. We want to thank the program personnel for helping us identify these issues. We've talked to a lot of programs in the past 3 years. And in particular, we want to thank Cindy Grutzik of San Francisco State and Pia Wong of CSU Sacramento, both of whom were instrumental in the development of these standards and helped us think through some of these issues as we were developing this item. And we look forward to working with the rest of the field. So before we get into the questions, a couple of things that are an undercurrent for the whole item. We wanted to make sure we define the terms. So we tried to define the important terms so that we're all talking about the same thing today. In particular, we defined clinical practice on pages 2 and 3 as the broad umbrella term for those experiences that a candidate has within a TK-12 classroom or school community that are organized by their preliminary credential program. In other words, it's not a candidate out on his or her own without any guidance or intentionality of what they're to get out of the experience. Clinical practice experiences includes early experiences, typically observing, through practice, student teaching in a teacher's classroom where the candidate is applying different pedagogical strategies, approaches, classroom management, and so forth in a safe environment under the guidance of a master teacher and his or her program. For interns, this would be the intern experience under the guidance of the program. The clinical practice experience continues all the way through a culminating experience that is 4 weeks of solo or co-teaching. I wanted to mention interns. The same clinical practice standard applies to interns. They are subject to the same standard, but in a much different context as they are the teacher of record in their own classroom. Nevertheless, the expectation is they are guided and heavily supported by the preparation program and their employing districts. Another area that's an undercurrent is that clinical practice standard does not exist in a vacuum. It's easy to get caught up in the language of the standard by itself, but it's critical to remember that the standards work together. So, for example, regardless of where a person does his or her clinical practice placement, Program Standard 2 requires that the program provide the candidate with opportunities to learn, apply, and reflect on all of the TPEs. And Standard 5 addresses the assessment of those TPEs through the TPA. So when staff is asked whether a placement is appropriate, we often respond back to the institution with a question. How will the program ensure that the candidate is getting opportunities to learn, apply, and reflect on all the TPEs? If a particular placement cannot do that, then the program must either find a different placement or augment that placement for the candidate with those other experiences that he or she can complete so that they can complete the requirements. Another point I want to make is that some of the language of the current standards was rooted in the need to allow that innovation. Prior to the adoption of these new standards, our previous standards were actually an impediment to some of the more effective program pathways that we are doing today, such as the residency model. And so as residencies really began to take root throughout the nation, California programs were really struggling to try to figure out how to make those work within the current standards. So as we talk about these issues, we want to make sure to maintain that ability of programs to have some flexibility to try out these new and innovative approaches. This is a highly complex item and highly contextualized. These questions can get really weedy, especially when we're talking about things like supplementary authorizations and number of courses. But we really wanted to try to simplify as much as we can these issues and focus on some of these questions. And then lastly, we often don't like to talk about standards as something we need to enforce because to a large measure, the accreditation system and the commission standards is about ensuring quality in programs, and decisions are made using professional judgments by peer educators. However, the commission staff and accreditation teams can only uphold what's in the standards. It's important that the intent of the commission be accurately reflected in the careful and very specific language of the standards. So where there's intended to be flexibility, we need to understand that, and the standards should reflect that. And it's intended to be very specific, we need to understand that as well, and we will uphold that with little to no flexibility. So at the end of the day, it's the standards that guide the development of programs, and it's the standards upon which the accreditation teams make the decisions. So I'm going to turn it over to Jake, who is going to walk through these questions that we've set forth, and then we're hoping you can come back and talk about them individually so that we have some guidance. They're all sort of very different.
Okay, good morning, commissioners. As Cheryl mentioned, I'll be walking through each of the questions briefly. We've also provided you with a single-page handout that just has the questions so that you can refer back to that during your discussions. So the questions are organized into 4 issue areas, and the first issue area starts on page 4. This area is around the overall structure of the 600 hours of clinical practice. So one question is about the distribution of time between early field experiences and student teaching within that clinical practice. The required 600 hours include a formal student teaching placement and early field experiences, but the standard is not specific on the distribution between the two of them. For instance, one program's candidates might complete 50 hours of early field experience and 550 hours in their student teaching placement, while another program's candidates might complete 300 of early field experience and 300 in their student teaching placement. Staff have understood the Commission's expectation to be that the largest portion of the 600 hours be in student teaching, but further Commission discussion on this topic would be helpful. On page 5 is the next question, which is whether the clinical practice hours need to span a full school year or can be for only portions of the school year. The previous set of standards were very explicit that the candidate needed to experience all phases of the school year. The current standards do not have this exact requirement. They simply say that they need to be across the arc of the program, but not across the arc of the school year. And the term arc of the program is not defined at this time. The next question is around the required 4 weeks of solo or co-teaching. The standards require this culminating solo or co-teaching experience to be of at least 4 weeks, but do not get more specific on number of hours or periods in a day during those 4 weeks. So it's possible that some candidates are teaching for 2 periods of a day or possibly for the entire day, depending on the credential that they're seeking and the program that they're in. So while all of these candidates are technically meeting the letter of the standard, there could be a wide variance in hours. Some programs have argued that it's compelling, there are compelling reasons for the variance based on the type of credential, but we'd like to hear the Commission's discussion on this topic. The next large issue area starts on page 6 of the item and is around supervision of candidates during the clinical practice. The current standards require the program to complete formal evaluations of the candidate, a minimum of 4 per quarter or 6 per semester, and require the district employed supervisor to provide 5 hours per week of guidance and support. Some programs have asked whether some or all of the formal program evaluations could be done instead by the site-based individual. We've heard that some programs are trying variations of this approach, where the district or site-based supervisor is taking on more responsibility on behalf of the programs. It could be argued that the standards intended, however, for them to have 2 distinct supervisors, one from the program and one from the district or site. So the discussion on this comes down to 2 questions. First, can the program delegate any of their evaluation responsibilities to the district? And if so, if they can, does that person who's doing the evaluation need to be someone other than the same supervisor, the same master teacher or district employed supervisor, or does it need to be a second person on campus or in the district that is not that same master teacher? Okay, turning to page 7, the next question is regarding the role of the program supervisor and whether it should be more clearly defined. The current standards state the number of formal evaluations and the qualifications of the supervisor. However, some programs have indicated a desire to further define that role. For example, should there be a more explicit requirement and language saying that there needs to be coordinated collaboration between the program supervisor and the district supervisor? The next question in this area is regarding the credential match between the candidate and the district employed supervisor. So Program Standard 3D says that the district employed supervisor must hold, and this is exact language, a clear credential in the content area for which they are providing supervision. So it says clear credential in the content area. Some programs have asked whether a candidate can be supervised instead by a teacher who does not hold the clear credential, but rather a subject matter authorization or a supplementary authorization in the content area. For a little more background on those authorizations, these are authorizations that are granted to teachers with a credential in one subject area who are seeking to teach courses outside of their credential content area, and they're granted these authorizations based on the completion of college coursework. For example, a teacher who has a single subject credential in social science could be teaching some English courses with one of these authorizations for English content. The standard says that a clear credential in the content area is needed, however, so a strict reading, as I was saying, of the standard would prohibit this individual from supervising a single subject candidate in English. But some have argued that it should be allowed when the program has knowledge that this teacher would be an exemplary supervisor in the English content area as well. The question for the Commission today is whether there should be this flexibility or whether it should stick with the very specific language on holding the matching credential. All right, another question on page 8. This is regarding the 10 hours of training That's required for all district employed supervisors. The majority of questions received by staff have been around whether veteran supervisors need the same training as new supervisors. A program sponsor alert, which we call PSAs, was issued back in May, and commission staff believes that PSA answers this question sufficiently. However, some have also questioned whether there's more guidance needed about the content of the training. The program standards have some language on the content. What it says is that it requires an initial orientation of a minimum of 10 hours. That includes information on program curriculum, effective supervision approaches, and current content-specific pedagogy and instructional practices. It also does require ongoing support to ensure that supervisors stay current with respect to knowledge and skills for supervision and program expectations. Beyond this language, the question is, should there be more specific guidance on requirements in that training? Okay, moving to the third issue area. This is about settings for clinical practice. Staff has received questions about clinical practice placements at independent study schools, online schools, private schools, juvenile and adult correctional facility schools, and adult schools. The previous set of standards required each candidate to experience 2 different placements during clinical practice. This is no longer a requirement under the new standards, and so the question is whether a candidate can complete all of their clinical practice hours in these specific settings, and whether that candidate will then gain the breadth of experience needed for the credential. For example, a candidate who completes their entire clinical practice in an independent study setting may not be able to experience whole class instruction. The private school question and why that's included is a bit different from the other settings, but was brought up at the last commission meeting as a topic that you may want to revisit in this area. Again, the question for this is whether a candidate completing all of their clinical practice hours in these placements is suitable for the credential being earned, or whether the commission should issue further clarification on these placements. Okay, moving to the last issue area, which starts on page 10 of the item now. This is regarding some specific placement issues with multiple subject candidates. So the first one is for multiple subject candidates doing clinical practice in middle school core placements. So these are placements where candidates are teaching 2 or more subjects, but not teaching all subject areas authorized by the multiple subject credential. Does this candidate need to complete a clinical practice experience where all subjects are taught, or at least the 4 core areas? Or would the commission like to provide additional guidance for these candidates that are placed in middle schools in general? The final question is about teaching early literacy. For multiple subject candidates placed in middle schools or upper grades at an elementary school, the question is, does the candidate need an experience that guarantees them an opportunity to teach early literacy? So this is why we provided the handout, so that you've got a chance to keep track of all these questions. We also want to recognize that there are many other questions that we've received that talk about clinical practice experiences and how they may allow candidates to teach all content areas, all grade spans, or gain experience in all of the various settings that the credential authorizes. So we plan to come back to you with further thoughts after the discussion today.
Yeah, thank you. We're interested in hearing what the commissioners.
We do have one public comment, and Michelle Badavinac. How do you pronounce it? Okay, that was far. Badavinac. Please state your name and your affiliation.
My name is Michelle Badavinac. I'm from Teachers College of San Joaquin. I just want to thank you all very much for dedicating time to talk about these very complex issues. I can tell you from a program standpoint, Cheryl has probably received a number of questions from me myself. And so while we appreciate the flexibility of the standards very much, we also would like to acknowledge that without clear guidance on some of these questions, we may not be meeting the intent. So we're looking forward to that. But I'd also like to ask you that as you're discussing these in the future, that you really think about all of the multiple pathways that are available to earning a credential. And I think Cheryl kind of alluded to that earlier. So we have traditional student teaching programs, we have intern programs, we now have residency programs, and they all are very unique in context. And specifically, I'd like to focus my comments on the intern pathways, because interns are not traditionally placed the same way that a student teacher is placed. They're really placed in partnership with a district, but it's based on district hiring needs and their inability typically to find a fully credentialed teacher for a certain subject area. They do work in collaboration with us, but then that candidate is hired as the official teacher of record, and so they are teaching full-time in that setting. And that's important to know when you're thinking about certain questions, specifically as you're looking at the need potentially for multiple placements. So if you had a candidate who was teaching, say, in the upper grades, and now you want to think about having them teach in the lower grades in an early placement, how does that happen when they're already teaching full-time and are being paid for that? So that would impact both the candidate as well as the program, and really most importantly the district that we are partnering with to provide that opportunity. The same thing would be true if you started thinking about dual credential programs or the new special ed standards, where we really do want that common trunk, and how do you provide full, rich experiences for interns in both general ed and special ed settings. We're committed to trying to figure that out, but it's complex when you are a full-time teacher. And then finally, I'd like to just speak briefly about the core settings. That's also an issue, specifically with interns. We have a lot of 5th through 8th grade teachers who are placed in a core setting where they're teaching only 2 subject areas. And so in relation to that, what I'd like you to think about is, as you're discussing any of these items moving forward, to also be simultaneously considering the impact of the TPA. So the TPA currently for multiple subject teachers requires that they do 1 cycle in literacy and 1 cycle in mathematics. We don't propose that that gets changed. And we have approached it in a way that if someone's teaching, say, a math and a science, their literacy lesson is an integrated lesson, still focused on the literacy standards so they can demonstrate those skills. But if there are other changes made, those also might impact TPA. One of the other examples I would give might be if we allow candidates to work in a jail setting, for example, and as Cheryl says, you have to take these things all in the context, as a whole. So one part of the standards says that you must be placed somewhere that allows videotaping. Well, jails don't allow videotaping, but yet our TPA does have a provision to do a type of a test that doesn't require videotaping. So there's some inconsistency there, which we appreciate the flexibility, but it is hard to grapple with as a program. So that would be my plea to you as you move forward, and I just thank you for taking all of those things into consideration as you move forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, seeing no further public comments, I'll open it up for discussion. And I believe everyone has seen the yellow insert in your folders, which I had not. Thank you. And so there are 4 questions here based on the presentation just given by Ms. Hickey and Mr. Schuler. So what is suggested is that we take one question at a time, and we'll start discussion with question 1, and that is talking about the 600 hours of clinical practice. There are 3 questions here, so we'll break it up, A, B, and C, and you don't need me to read these out loud to you, right? You can. All right, so commissioners, do we have any comments on the 600 hours of clinical practice? Okay. Commissioner Francois.
Thank you for this, and I appreciate the questions on this handout. Going back and forth was a bit much. I have a clarifying question. On page 2, in the definition for clinical the definitions for clinical practice and student teaching. For clinical practice, it says the term clinical practice should serve as the broadest term describing those experiences that a candidate has within a K-12 classroom or school community. Can you clarify for me what staff's thinking about in terms of school community? What would that look like? Because as I look at where 600 hours can take place, it looks like it's all in the classroom.
So the term school community was actually a suggestion by a couple of programs who suggested that some of the experiences outside of the classroom itself. So, for instance, participating in an IEP meeting, participating in back to school night. Some of those may count. They're very deliberate. They may have very assignments associated with them. Those kinds of things. So they wanted to make sure to capture the whole breadth of things that may maybe that they think should count as the learning experience for a candidate. So that's what that means.
Okay, thank you. So one of my questions, and I think it's something that we struggle with at our institution, is the descriptions of clinical practice include early field work, and I can't find it here, student teaching. There's 4 criteria, so to speak. And I'm wondering what the rationale is to include early field work, because the way that you describe it, then any additional kind of field work that's not early on in the experience would not count towards that 600 hours. And I think removing early really does broaden it as you intended in the definition of clinical practice.
Part of our question and needing further work, because I think there is sufficient maybe inconsistent language or confusion on the part of all programs about, what are those things that are early experiences? Can those count, and when do they count? And we've struggled with that over time. We certainly know that once you're in your placement, that those hours count. But how do you count those early or other experiences? I'm not sure I'm capturing your question per se. You might want to restate it.
So let me just give an example, for instance, because I still read these examples or descriptors as in-class experiences, with the exception of early field experience. Say towards the end of, or in the middle of the program, candidates are asked to go and interview parents, family members, school personnel for their Ed TPA. That's not an early field experience. It's a field experience, but it's not early. But it also doesn't fall under the category of student teaching, co-teaching, solo teaching, whatever those other 3 things are. And so I think, and I've heard this from my colleagues at the UCs, is that doesn't count. And yet it's valuable experience that all teachers, if you're good at what you do, you're out collecting data, right, to inform your practice. But we're struggling with, does that count as part of the 600 hours or does it not count?
We've struggled with those very same questions. So the way we have gone about doing it is that if it is part of the program where there is some intentionality by the program to go do something and it's outside of the classroom, those hours should count. But that's really hard to define, and it will differ from program to program. But that's exactly right. As long as it is part of the program, it's intentional, there's some opportunity for candidates to reflect and to use in their classroom, then those things should count. And that we have at this point in time left to the program to decide how to count those hours or not count those hours.
That's what I was hoping that you would say. And that's not clear to the programs. And we've been doing this for a lot of years. It's not clear in the language here. So I don't know what we can do about that.
Commissioner Sloan?
So I'm just thinking about this whole item, which is a very large item, and the purpose for having it come is that you all have now gathered a lot of feedback from the field, people implementing policy. These are the questions that have come forward, and you're putting them out now. What's some guidance on where we should go next? And so Commissioner Francois' questions about, can you clarify this? But also within those questions, there was hey, we think this is an important part of becoming a teacher and the experiences. And so I just wanted to make the comment that as we are providing guidance and feedback, it's also about our professional expertise about what we think we might want to be seeing in this next generation of standards language around this work. So to bear that in mind as we're talking about some of these. And then I could comment a couple of things on this section as well, but I'm going to let other commissioners speak first.
Commissioner Wall?
So in response, you used the word intentionality. And I wonder how we can help to articulate that, to me, how key that is. Because I have observed that, some of the same descriptions in a syllabus or expectations of a program can be superficial, or they can be super meaningful depending upon the intentionality. And I actually think of it as akin to medical education and the spiraled nature of curriculum design. And so even if you're not doing a residency program, how intentional are those fieldwork activities in terms of their integration into what's happening in the classroom setting? And I think it's a very hard thing to make clear for people that simply going into a school and spending a few hours is not the same thing as carrying out a very intentional observation that has specific learning goals that then is going to be discussed and reflected upon in class. And there's truly something to come out of that. And I can't tell you exactly how to do that, but that would be my hope, is that we could be more clear about what the intentionality is of every experience.
Commissioner Hind?
Yeah, I wouldn't want to micromanage how those hours are broken up. I just think that's dangerous, and I think it takes away from the purpose of why we want candidates to have field experience. Taking the comments, think if we could write something in a way that encompasses what the needs are for that community, not just the teachers, but the needs of the students and the community members around it, that would best serve it. So our home visits gonna are those really important? Our visits to, taking your teachers to the Museum of Tolerance and giving them that education, is that going to be something that's going to better their craft? So whatever it is that your program thinks is going to best reflect and represent the students and the populations that you're not only serving, but will also help you to become a deeper thinker as you become a teacher. So we're not micromanaging where you're putting your hours, but maybe you don't need to go to the ice cream social as part of your hours, but maybe that is something that's really important in your community and you do need to be there. So those types of things, there's knowing kind of what's going to make you serve your population to the best of your ability.
Director Sandy?
I was intrigued by your use of the word intentionality, Commissioner Wall, and curious about which direction you were thinking intentionality needed to be expressed, in the standards or in the program response to standards, or both.
I actually was thinking more in program response, but I could see it being helpful to programs to articulate that in additional ways in the standard as well. But I was thinking about programs responding explicitly, because I appreciate the comment about professional autonomy, right? I mean, I think that local settings can be really smart about how they're going to respond to standards, but I think they have to be really clear about what they're trying to accomplish.
So if I could build on these two comments, I was also thinking about this first question about distribution of field experiences and student teaching hours may not be so much about distribution or defining things in ways that are too restrictive, but in now developing some quality indicators that we can put out there so that programs can respond with how they're meeting those and what their intentionality is for the particular students and teachers they serve. And so this is, again, not super clear guidance, but this is where I think we're saying, here's some things we want to work on, And then after this item is done, we're going to figure out, okay, how are we going to work on those? But I like that idea. The other thing I really liked about this item were some of the definitions that we already have out there that you all have provided about what field experience and student teaching is. And I'll just quote, where candidates are provided with multiple opportunities to practice their pedagogical skills and to purposefully and deeply engage in developing their own practice under the guidance of both the master teacher and program supervisor. Student teaching is also defined as where the candidate's taking part in the planning, leading, and assessment of instruction within the classroom. So it's good to have these definitions, and then on top of that, what do we know about what makes clinical practice quality? And are there ways that we can identify those in the standards so that programs can meet them and tell us how they're meeting them and what their intentions are? I also, under the same area, the other two questions under here involving the school year timing and the solo or co-teaching requirement, if maybe we could fold all of those in under that area one. So the school year timing is an interesting one, and I would love to hear what commissioners have to say about that one. So this was the issue where do we want to ensure that field experiences are occurring across an academic year so that teacher candidates are experiencing all of the important phases of the academic year? Does that mean then they have to be in a field experience from when before schools start until when schools finish? That's one way of looking at it. Another way I think of looking at it is, can we identify particular experiences within the school year that we want to be sure that every teacher candidate has some exposure to? So for instance, is it important to be there before school starts and see how teachers set up their classrooms? Is it important to be there on the first day of school? Is it important to participate in parent-teacher conferences, back to school nights? You know, what are the things that we think are sort of critical milestones in the academic year that we want our teacher candidates to be participating in? And maybe there's even here's an ideal, show us what you can do. And when I started thinking about this, I started thinking about, for a long time we've talked about, is there a way to identify exemplary practices and programs who are doing exemplary things? You know, perhaps another way of thinking about this is putting out, here's what we think are exemplary practices. And of course, contexts differ, and the ways in which programs are designed differ, but show us how you are meeting, you know, a variety of these, some of these, all of these, etc. So the school year timing, I'm just going to throw that out, and I'm curious to see what others have to say on that one.
Commissioner Barnes and then Commissioner Kuhn.
That's actually a very interesting point, and I sat here thinking about it. We do this at the high school. Like, we ask our seniors, hey, can you tell our freshmen what you wish you, what would have helped you out freshman, sophomore year? And we have some of our students who graduate and come back and say, okay, what do you wish you would have done different in high school? So to find out, I mean, we can say what we think is important that I think a new teacher should be at, but be curious somehow to do a survey of teachers who've been out 1 or 2. What experience did they wish they would have had? Because when they're getting there and they're like, oh, I didn't know any about this, you know. So the people who are fresh out within a couple of years, it'd be kind of interesting if they would volunteer. But what do they wish that they had been exposed to? Because what I might think is important, they might have another perception, and they both might be important. So I think it is good to find out what, because that's how you improve. And that's how it's helped us with some of our programs at our school, because the students, they're going to tell you. They'll tell you the truth. So.
In terms of the 600 hours over a full year or 24 weeks or whatever, I think that we shouldn't require people to do it over a full year. Especially, it would be a financial barrier for many people, especially if you start student teaching in the spring semester in high school. That means you would have to complete it through next school year. And then you would complete your credential, and you have to wait till the following school year to apply to actually work. So it would take a longer time period for a teacher candidate to finally complete their credential if we required it to span a full year. So for that part, I think it should be done whenever they can complete their 600 hours, whether it's in 1 year, in 24 weeks, whatever.
Yeah, I was just thinking back when we started talking about this a couple of years ago of what's important for students to get out of their student teaching or their clinical experience. What do we really want them to do? We don't want to say, if you go into a school site 5 hours a day for 40 weeks, you are going to be a good teacher. Or if you go in so we don't want to do that. But we don't also want to make it so that it's not enough or it's not rich or it's not valuable so that they get into a classroom the next year and they really don't know what they're doing. And we also don't want it to be a financial burden because a lot of these teacher candidates are working, so they can't be in a classroom unpaid, which is why we started talking about residency models years ago. So I don't know the answer to that question. My student teaching was over the course of a full year. It worked for me. It really helped me out. I felt like I don't know how I would have done it, but I didn't have another example to do. I didn't try to rush into 24 weeks or whatever that looks like. I just don't think that we can say this is what you have to do. I think we have to give options, but with the goal in mind that we have high expectations for what we want you to come out of it with and what we want you to learn from your experience. So I don't know how that conversation goes or what that looks like in programs, but I don't know what the answer is. But I just think that we can't get too hung up on there's a one-size-fits-all for student teaching because it doesn't. There's too many variables.
Commissioner Martinez?
Yeah, I think my comments are similar to many expressed, but Commissioner Hind, is my question is like, what is the purpose of clinical practice? And my understanding is to actually apply what you have learned. So I would have a very distinct bias towards clinical practice happening later in their experience as a teacher, because we want them to have the knowledge, the content knowledge, and the pedagogical strategies to therefore apply what they've learned in class into a classroom, which I think, or into a school, which I think is very different than having an experience. If that's an observation, if that's, just experiencing what school looks like. So I believe clinical, and so I think there should be some guiding principles that go with this. I mean, much like Alicia is like, you don't want to prescribe it, but I think if the guiding principle of clinical practice is application of content knowledge and pedagogical strategies, then when would that take place? When would that maximize that? And so I think we need to put some guiding principles together. And also if we think about learning as scaffolded, it also seems then we can also put some guiding principles around scaffolding, which again means they're applying what they've learned later on in their learning career.
Student Rep Shoup.
Thank you. I wanted to agree with what Commissioner Hein was saying, and I know personally for me and even for some people in my cohort, when you're picking a school to do your credential at, to obtain your credential, you also look at what districts that the students do their student teaching at, and oftentimes you're picking a district that you foresee yourself working for, or at least a school that works with that district. And so I think that not micromanaging it is important, because at a different district, it looks different. So some of us were in Riverside, some of us were in Val Verde, Moreno Valley, and we all had very different student teaching experiences because each of those districts has a different community of students, different socioeconomic statuses. And so having it be open and allowing some of us to go to, back to school nights, because speaking with the parents is important in that district, especially when they come from, families that are, they come from like adoption families, or they're in, what's the word I'm looking for? Foster care. Yeah. So speaking with the parents in those districts is important, whereas other districts, maybe you have more high maintenance parents, and in special education, that's very important. So going to those IEP meetings was very important then, because there was a lot of advocates at those meetings. So depending on the district you were at, your student experience looked very different. Even in just the small 8, we only had 8 people in my cohort, but we all had very different experiences, and we all ended up in the districts that we student taught in. And I think that there's something to say for that, especially when you're picking your school of choice. So I just wanted to share that.
Thank you. Any other comments? Commissioner Slum?
Yes, I'm also thinking about just the overall, what is the purpose of student teaching, and how we look at how we develop our understanding of how to teach. And there is the idea that we're applying what we're learning in coursework to what we're doing in the classroom. And then there's lots of complexities around that. And I'm thinking back to sort of a seminal piece of work that Marilyn Cochran Smith and Susan Lytle did. I think it was in the late 90s, and it was the relationship between the knowledge and practice. And they identified different ways of learning practice, and I think it was learning in practice, learning for practice, and learning of practice. Somebody correct me if I've got that wrong, but thank you. And so it is these ideas of learning in of and for practice that might be important to sort of go back to as we're thinking about what clinical practice is about. But I did want to move to this idea, the next piece about the solo or co-teaching requirement, the 24 weeks, because this is another interesting one, and I just thought I would move our attention to what the definition is. So you provided a good definition in the appendix on page, starting at the bottom of page 17 and the top of page 18 of this item. And the basic idea about what you mean, or what we currently mean by solo and co-teaching, as well as this time requirement that we currently have, that solo or co-teaching should be 4 weeks, and that there is questions out there about what that means, because the 4 weeks of solo teaching has been implemented in different ways across programs, implemented in different ways across credential areas, because there are very different needs within a multiple subject placement versus a single subject placement. And so you raise good questions about, I think, first of all, we're exploring, well, what does it mean, and why do we need to have solo teaching or co-teaching? And then how do we accomplish that in different contexts? So one question I have is, what is the purpose of this solo teaching, co-teaching? There's this idea that we've had for a long time that before a teacher candidate goes out into the field and becomes a teacher, they should have some experience of the full day of teaching for a month so they know what they're getting into. And so that is something that we have worked with. That means that they're in the classroom all day long, whether they're teaching in secondary or elementary, and they're experiencing everything that you do throughout the day. As a teacher, go home at night, prepare for the next day, and that's what you're doing. There's another argument that says, while candidates are learning to teach, this is an opportunity for them to develop slowly, to have time to reflect back, to have the input from supervisors and mentor teachers, to really, this is their only chance that they get to really have that deep opportunity to reflect on their practice. And when they're in the classroom and doing it every day, all day long, they don't have that opportunity as much. So how do we balance those two things? And then the third thing around this is, does it need to be in this 4-week concentrated period of time? There's all sorts of ways we can construct it, and that programs have constructed it, as you've said. So if we think about 4 weeks of solo co-teaching at 5 hours a day, say that they're in a classroom teaching, that's 100 hours. And different programs have done different things, I know, over time. So there might be in a secondary program, somebody might be the solo teacher of one period per day across the entire semester, 16 weeks or something like that. At other periods of the day, the candidate might be co-teaching, or they might be doing particular things. But across that semester, they have done particular things. And one thing I would say that's important for solo teaching, co-teaching, is not just experiencing how hard it is to be on your toes every hour of the day teaching, but also how you take students from one point in the beginning of a semester or a year to another point, your goals for them, and you monitor them along the way, and you start to understand how what you're doing is affecting how they're learning, and analyzing how they're learning and building on that as you go with the support of your mentors. So those are the two things I think we really have to weigh here. What is it that we really want from this experience?
Just to echo a lot of what you just said, Commissioner Sloan. I was looking at on page 18, number 2, when it's talking about what the language already says. And in there, it talks about the requirement of 4 weeks is to ensure that the candidate experiences the full range of instruction rather than sporadic lesson delivery. Well, sporadic lesson delivery is different than developing a unit of study and possibly only teaching, you might only be teaching 1 hour a day. Maybe you're just doing math, but you're doing math over the course of 2 weeks trying to deliver a unit. And along that time, you're assessing the students, you are seeing what's working, you're changing your instruction, you're reflecting with your master teacher on successes and areas for improvement, and really taking the time to dig deep into what you're actually doing in the classroom. Knowing how hard the job is and how tired you're going to be, that's just, it's going to come. You're going to see it. You see it you knew it when you were in class. But what's really important, I think intent is kind of the word of the day for this this topic, is that we want our teachers to feel that they might not always deliver a perfect lesson, but that they know what their objectives are and how to get there, and to be able to reflect on their practice. And that's why they're with a master teacher who can help them reflect and go back and forth and really think deeply about the work that they're doing. So again, I think the language is already pretty clear in what's there. Just giving the programs and the master teachers and the student teachers the ability to do what they know is best practice and to be able to reflect and to show that they're learning along the way.
So I'm slightly a meta comment. I mean, it's striking me that one of the things that we have here is people asking what's compliance. And I wonder if we couldn't almost position like a rubric, but not necessarily a rubric, where compliance thinking is this, but actual performance and desired outcome thinking is this. So if you're just simply thinking about compliance towards this, it's this thing. But what we're really aiming for is a more descriptive nature of here's the kind of experience we're hoping people have. Because I think people are, the way this is framed a little bit throughout is, how do I comply? Well, if that's all we're aspiring towards, I don't think that's enough. I think we want to guide people to think about, well, what we really want from this is these types of things. And, we've done such a good job with that actually with other performance metrics. I mean, some similar type of thinking might actually really provide guidance.
Any other comments, commissioners? I just want to add a comment, adding to what Commissioner Hind and Student Representative Shub talked about with the micromanaging, that it's important that we don't, because we do have local control in our districts, right? And they are very different. However, I think being able to link activities to student achievement might be something that we can, like, why am I just doing this because everybody's going to the game? Or is this going to add to the sense of belonging that, or the trust that students have in me when they see me on Monday? That, oh, Ms. Rodriguez was at my game, right? Because so why am I doing this? As opposed to just doing things, if there's, if we could have a purpose, intent for why we're doing what we're doing. On to question 2, supervision of candidates during clinical practice. Commissioner Allavi.
I don't know if we're taking these in any particular order, or are we just kind of talking about the whole general subject?
Okay. The general question, if you have one of the letter items that you'd like to.
Well, I'm going to dive in. I'm going to dive into number D. This is a topic that is giving my district a lot of headaches in terms of how to navigate, and could use some clarification of language. In our real life scenario, we have currently about between 50 and 60 student teachers in about 8 different programs. And each of the schools, unless they're in the collaboration, each of the schools has kind of approached this 10-hour training very differently. Okay, and that's having trouble in our district fulfilling our student teaching positions, because they're now asking our teachers to say, you got to do these 10 hours. Well, this school requires this. Well, this school is saying that that's okay, you can do that. So there's this is an area of great concern to our district because as Ms. Shube pointed out, we get our teachers through our student teaching, and so we really want to correct this. The first is the question of new. And even though your PSA called out veteran, it still did not clarify the question for us because programs are saying, are you new to our program? Are you a veteran to our program, or are you just new to student teaching in general, or are you a veteran of student teaching in general? So that does need to be clarified because some programs are accepting these teachers and some are not. And then some of the background information is not being accepted equally. So we train all of our teachers in Danielson, which some of the programs are saying is good. And we'll accept that Danielson training as part of your background training. And some are saying no. So that's got to be, and so our teachers are saying, well, if they don't accept that, then I've got to do the whole 10 hours for this school. But I don't have to do the whole 10 hours for that school. So you can see where some of the problems are arising. So I really ask that we kind of delve in. Even I read your PSA, and even I could see that people were reading it two different ways. So
well, we appreciate that feedback, and we can certainly reach out. I think the intent of the PSA is to put the onus on the institution or the approved program to determine what that need is, how you define the veteran teacher, whether they have many years of experience in another district serving as the district employed supervisor and they're new to your district. But really a lot of flexibility in this for the program to make those decisions, and to look at the person individually and say, oh, they've demonstrated, they've done this for many, many years. They're very effective. They just need to learn what's unique about our program. So maybe they only need an hour of orientation to our program, to the new TPEs, that kind of thing. So if we can make that clear, we're happy to do that.
Are you comfortable then, and I ask this just because our HR people are not, we're all over the map on this. Are you comfortable then with one teaching institution having a very different standard than another?
Mm-hmm. I think that's a question for you all.
Well, that's the whole ticket there. That's the whole ticket. And I think I'm comfortable with some deviation, of course, but I'm not sure I'm comfortable with deviation that would say, this teacher has been master teaching for 10 years, but she can no longer teach with this institution because it doesn't fit, but she can with that student teaching group. It just it's too wide a discrepancy, I think, in that regard.
So we can continue to gather some information from the field about how it's being implemented in the field. We know that this is a hot topic. We hear it at every conference and at every place we go that this is causing some consternation. So we're happy to gather more information to see how, if we can make it more clear or more consistent across the board, and we're happy to look into that.
Commissioner Hind?
I was going to comment on letter C about is it appropriate to pair a candidate with a district employed supervisor who holds a supplementary or subject matter authorization in the content area? I think that's fine. I mean, my personal opinion, I think it's fine. They've already got a credential in something, which means they have pedagogy on how to teach, which is really what you are helping the student teacher accomplish, is how to teach. The subject matter authorization means that they have proven to some extent that they have competency enough to teach that area without actually holding the credential. So I don't feel that there's any lack of qualification to be a supervising teacher in that.
It's really helpful. This is an area where we might want to look at adjusting slightly the language of the standard to make sure that, because a strict reading of that says that they can't do it. At least that's how I read it. I don't know if that's how you read it. But as we work with programs, and we talk about systems of support and those kinds of things, we can see where a person could have, maybe an exemplary teaching history in those areas and would have all the things that somebody with a clear credential could. So, is the program the adequate the right place to make those decisions? Maybe so. And so we may want to come back with just slight adjustments to allow that to be real clear.
Also for equity purposes too, if you're looking at, rural districts where you don't have the teachers to fill all those spots. So then therefore that candidate would never be able to complete a program. So.
Commissioner Sloan?
One question I have, because I've always wondered, again, this came, 2016, we developed all of these standards, and we put this in place to ensure at least, I think we put in the 10 hours of initial orientation and training for mentors to ensure that the mentor teachers our candidates were working with knew something about the program, knew something about mentoring new teachers. We know that just because you are a great teacher of K-12 or TK-12 students doesn't necessarily mean you are a great mentor of adults or teacher candidates. So that there were good reasons for wanting to strengthen the qualifications and experiences of our mentor teachers and the opportunities that they would have to do that work. Most of the time, our mentor teachers are eager to learn more about how they can better support the candidates in their classrooms. They just don't always have the time. But one thing I've always wondered about is the difference between how we created the MS, the multiple subject and single subject standard around this, and the induction standard for mentors. And in the induction standards, the way we have said, or the standard 4 around qualification, selection, and training of mentors, we've actually identified a set of quality criteria that we expect these mentors to meet. And I've always been intrigued by that and thought, if this could work, this seems a better way of saying, here's, again, what we expect in the performance of a mentor and the knowledge and experience of a mentor. And then programs you show us that the mentors you have are meeting these qualifications and criteria. So one question I have is, how has that been successful for induction programs? Have they also gone through the same kinds of questions? Have they had trouble telling us as a commission during accreditation processes, here, yes, our mentors are qualified, and here's the evidence? Has that worked well or not?
I think probably Karen Sacramento and Gabe Roby would be most able to answer that, but I have not heard the same level of questioning or wonderings about this section in induction as we are hearing about the multiple single subject preliminary programs. So, and Terry's going to come to the table. We're calling a friend on this one.
Chair Sloan, you've identified a key difference between the induction standards and the preliminary standards. The induction standards have a full standard on what the mentor teacher's characteristics are, what training they're supposed to have, and the job they're supposed to do. Whereas the preliminary standards are pretty darn silent on all of that. They say that the district employee supervisors gets 10 hours of training and not a whole lot else. And they don't specify very much at all about the program supervisor either. So what we should do is look at the induction standards, which is standard 4, qualifications, selection, and training of mentors, which is quite specific, and maybe work with some programs to see for the preliminary world, would some of that language be appropriate to help guide more in the preliminary world? Mm-hmm. That was standing in for Karen and Gay.
That's good. And what I'm hearing is that may replace the very prescriptive nature of the 10 hours of training is what I'm hearing. That's possible.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just again, this is an instance where we have a number of unintended consequences that we didn't know when we first put this out there. And now we're learning from it. I do have other comments, sorry. You can go on and see if anybody else has comments, but I have more on this.
Does anyone else have comments on this item? Commissioner Martinez?
Just question 2. I think we should.
Big decisions. No, I was just going to actually echo Commissioner Wall earlier. Is this a compliance issue, or is this, and I think that's kind of what you hit on, and I think that's how we have to look at it. What are some descriptors that would really get to our intention and what we're looking for. So I love Terry's idea around looking at the induction standards. Certainly we don't have to model them specifically, but it is trying to get to quality versus the compliance issue.
I have a couple more comments on some of the other pieces here under number 2. And one of them has to do with the number of observations that are required there's district employed supervisor hours of support, and then there are the program actual formal observations. And they read as program supervisors need to do formal evaluations 4 times in a quarter or 6 times in a semester. And those observations need to result in some sort of data that can be aggregated and analyzed. This is another place where I think programs have struggled in a number of ways. And I think in some cases programs have struggled with what does this mean, and what's the compliance issue, and trying to contort their work around that, whereas others have been able to say, here's the way that we do supervision over the course of a year. Not every single visit results in aggregatable data. Is aggregatable a word?
Aggregate data?
Aggregative data. And because sometimes it's, for instance, I'll say the program that I worked in, our candidates were visited every week, but one week it was an informal drop-in, seeing how things are doing, and certain goals that the supervisor knew this candidate needed to work on. And then the following week would be a more formal observation against more formal criteria with aggregatable data. But every observation also wasn't 15 items relating to TPEs either. So I know different programs do it in different ways. And I think we need to get a handle on that a little bit more, because the way the language reads now, too, is it's not until a candidate is in student teaching that these observations need to take place. And so again, then here's the difference between early field work and student teaching. And I think it also becomes a cost issue for programs. So there are some programs that believe that a candidate should be student teaching across the entire year. Well, for that program, that means 12 of these formal observations that supervisors need to do. Another program may concentrate their student teaching in the second half of the year. That's half the required supervision. So looking at this piece.
Those are exactly all those comments are exactly the kind of feedback we've gotten from institutions. I mean, everything from they're trying to experiment with budgets, trying to be more supportive of some of the master teachers or some of the district level. So there's budget issues, there's issues of flexibility, and we don't do it that way, and it's not fair because it's structured differently. So those are exactly, you're right on point on all of those.
Okay. And the final point I'm going to make on this area too has to do with the other qualifications of district employed supervisors and program employed supervisors. And you raised the question about, in some programs they're asking, can we just have district employed supervisors do the supervision? And I don't know that it's so much a matter of who's doing it as what they know and why we have different supervisors engaging in the practice. In the very beginning of this item, we had a very good description of what we want clinical practice to be. And AACTE talks about clinical practice being very integrated with all the other aspects of the program. That means coursework, where you're applying your work to the practice, or if you're learning in practice, you're also drawing on the other things that you're learning. So the people doing the supervision probably, I think, need to have multiple kinds of experiences to help candidates integrate their learning into their practice. If a district employed supervisor knows well the program and knows well the coursework that the candidates are doing and the kinds of work that is expected of them to demonstrate in practice, then that should be the criteria, I think, for who's supervising. But I think you also raised in another part of this item, what do we want our program supervisors? What are their qualifications? That is where we should probably be focusing our attention. And how do we know then?
Comments, commissioners? Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to leave items 3 and 4 until after lunch so that we can take a lunch break and regenerate. Let's see here. It's 1:20. I'm sorry. Should we be back at 1:20? 1 hour? Is that? Okay. All right. Have a good lunch. Provecho.